Call into order the Tuesday, July 1st, 2014 meeting of the Township of South Orange Village Board of Adjustment. May we have a roll call?
Yes, Mr. Don.
Here.
Mrs. Descala.
Here.
Mr. Reeves.
Here.
Mr. Polipiano. Mr. Aller.
Here.
And Ms. Wellen. Here.
Pursuant to Section 5, Chapter 231, PO 1975, this is to state for the record that adequate notice of this meeting has been provided to the public by posting and maintaining the annual notice of regular meetings on the bulletin board in Village Hall, by publishing the annual notice of regular meetings for 2014 in the December 2013 edition of the South Orange Maplewood News Record, and by filing said notice in the office of the village clerk. And Ms. Davis, I think I cut you off. You were about to ask if Mr. Breen was here.
No, I just noticed he wasn't here.
Okay, all right, he's not here. I think we're still expecting Mr. Parlapiano to arrive presently. Okay, so the first order of business for tonight is approval of the minutes, but we don't have those minutes here, do we, for the meeting on May 27th, correct, Ms. Davis?
I only sent the ones for May 27th.
For May 27th. Okay.
And here he is.
Okay. All right, the record will reflect that Mr. Parlapiano has arrived. So, do we have any comments on the May 27th minutes?
I think they fairly reflected the meeting.
I didn't have any.
Did anybody receive these minutes?
Yes.
I think. I don't think it was here.
Does
Yes.
anybody else have any comments on them? We have a motion. Does anybody else have comment on seconding the motion? I can second it if nobody else wants to. I'll second it.
Okay, Mr. Don.
Yes.
Mrs. Descala.
Yes.
Mr. Polipiano.
Yes.
Mr. Reeves.
Yes.
Mr. Aller.
Yes.
And Ms. Wellen.
Abstain.
Okay, so now we move on to the approval of the resolution for South Orange Dental Center. I recuse myself for this meeting, so, Mr. Don, do you have anything to say
No,
about the...
I read through the resolution, and I didn't really have any comments on it. I found the wording of the resolution very succinct into what we had approved, specific to the number of doctors, the number of professionals, and the number of staff on site. The comment regarding them making the ground floor handicap accessible, all the items that were specifically noted as conditions of the approval. So I don't really have any additions or modifications to propose. I think it's a very well-written resolution.
Any other comments?
I'll move to accept the resolution.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, Mr. Don.
Yes.
Mrs. Descala.
Yes.
And Ms. Wellen.
Yes.
Then we have the approval of the resolution for the case we heard. Most recently was the case 1013 Wesso Realty at 19 Prospect Street. So we have that resolution.
I haven't seen it. If I got it, I haven't seen
Well, we
it.
got it late this afternoon.
We got it late this afternoon. I haven't seen it.
I've actually had time to read it, and I think it accurately reflects what went on in the meeting.
Excuse me, we can't hear you.
Can you all hear me now?
No.
Can you hear me now? Is this better?
Thank you.
Is this better? Okay. So I think it accurately reflects the meeting and what went on in the meeting. And as pertains to our decision-making and also their, what they agreed to do as well.
Mr. Chairman, there were a couple of minor modifications to that. I sent a copy to the applicant's attorney, and she reminded me that Mr. Zuckerman's first name is Bob, the gentleman from Village Alliance. That will be inserted. And the spelling for her other witness, Siri, is S-I-R-Y, not S-I-R-I, so that'll be changed.
Okay.
And there was also a late comment I got a few minutes ago, actually, about the variance for signage. And maybe, Susan, you can help us with where we ended up on that. The resolution reflects a signage variance for that westerly-facing wall sign over the private parking lot. And it was my understanding, and perhaps I'm incorrect, that the balance of the signage was essentially approved. Is that correct?
No, I think there was
No.
there was a second variance for the ground sign in the front.
Is that, okay?
But I,
And we eliminated the...
yeah, you eliminated the
We eliminated
directory,
the
two directory
that's right,
signs
but we-
on the building.
That's right.
Yeah.
We eliminated the two directory signs in the building. We kept the ground sign in the front. That was one variance. Second variance was the one facing the private parking lot.
But I can't really comment on it because I voted the other way.
Yeah, they were, yeah, that's accurate.
Okay. Then that would be another change.
Okay.
There was an effort made to get this to the applicants. They were hoping to open in September, so that's why it was done late.
Okay, so with those changes, are there any other questions? Do we have a motion?
I'll move that we approve the resolution as amended.
Second?
Okay, Mr. Don,
Yes.
Mr. Parlapiano,
Yes.
Mr. Reeves,
Yes.
Mr. Eller,
I abstain.
Well, you can't.
Okay, so now we move on to the applications that are on the docket for this evening. The first case that we're going to hear is Seton Hall University. This is not the continuation. This is an interpretation of their property on 324 to 334 Valley Street, interpretation of Section 9250 of the Land Development Ordinance. Mr. Coakley? And just let me say, I anticipate this won't take too long, one way or the other, and then we're going to move straight on in to the main case.
I agree. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, Kevin Coakley, law firm of Connell Foley, on behalf of Seton Hall University. Sorry.
Why don't you put up the microphone a little bit? Yeah. Can you hear me if I'm closer to the microphone?
All right. Mr. Chairman, this matter involves the board's jurisdiction to interpret the zoning ordinance and/or to hear appeals of the decision of the zoning officer. So there's two different sections of the land use law that give the zoning board of adjustment authority with respect to this matter. And what it involves is a building that Seton Hall controls that involves about 30 units. And they're in the process of renovating the building, doing a stem to stern renovation of the building. And in the course of that, they uncovered that there are balconies on the building. Approximately half of the units have balconies, and the balconies are in a state of deterioration. So as part of the rehabilitation of the building, the plan is to take the balconies down and replace the doors leading to the balcony with windows. And Seton Hall went in for a building permit, and the building permit was granted as related to the interior of the building, and there was a demolition permit granted as well for the windows, et cetera. But the building permit was denied for the modification that would allow replacement of the doors with windows and the removal of the balconies. And that's why we're here this evening. The ordinance in question requires site plan approval, but gives various exemptions from site plan approval. And as Ms. Gruhl has outlined the ordinance, the principal issue is Section E of the ordinance, which exempts, and I'm going to read the ordinance just very quickly, renovations, repainting, or alterations to the exterior of a building or structure which do not involve any enlargement of the building or major structural change as determined by the administrative officer, which in this case is the zoning official. So the question is whether or not taking down these balconies and replacing the doors with windows constitutes a major structural change. There's no enlargement of the building. There's no change in ingress and egress to the useful part of the structure. That's all that's involved in this particular case. I have some pictures here that will show you what the balconies look like, if that would help your decision-making.
Okay, well, I'm not sure it's that simple. I wish it were that simple. Is this not also a non-conforming building?
I don't believe that that's a critical element to this discussion, but I don't believe it's a non-conforming building either. This is in the B2 zone, and the B2 zone allows, among other things, any use permitted in the business B1 district. And among the uses permitted in the B1 district are apartment buildings and apartment units above the first floor of business buildings. So, reading that slowly, apartment buildings and apartment units above the first floor of business buildings. So it seems clear that this is an apartment building. It's a unified 30-unit structure. So I don't believe it's a non-conforming use, but notwithstanding that, I believe that it's covered by the exemption, which I started to read, the key words of which were major structural change. So excuse me, you want to get a question?
Well, when you're done, I want to ask a question.
I'm finished.
I just want to go back to the beginning statement when you said that Seton Hall controls the building.
Yes, it's in the form of a condominium form of ownership. They all own all the units in the building, and I think that's the fact that it's in condominium form of ownership is irrelevant as a matter of law with respect to its characterization under the land use law.
But they own the units.
They own all the units. Okay. Yes.
And the students who live there rent that property under the same terms as a dormitory use that they were on campus?
I'm not sure the terms. They do rent those units from the university. And
what's the difference between an apartment building and a dormitory then?
Well, in this case, this is clearly an apartment building. It was built as such. It has the characteristics of an apartment building. So I don't think it's a dormitory. It's not on the campus.
I thought this was a non-conforming structure. If it's not a non-conforming...
It is a non-conforming structure, and it's a non-conforming use. I disagree with Mr. Copley.
Right, and so the issue is the use, not the nature of the structure.
It's the use of the property and the fact that apartment buildings are not permitted in the B1 zone unless they are above the first floor. Apartment buildings and apartment units above the first floor. That's how the ordinance is written. The B1 zone does not allow apartments unless they are above the first floor of a retail use.
With all due respect to Mr. Renda, that's not what the ordinance says. It says apartment buildings and apartment units above the first floor of business buildings. Clearly, it means apartment buildings, or the word "and" would have no meaning in this.
If apartment buildings were permitted use in the B1 zone, they would be listed separately. It would say apartment buildings, and then the next line would say apartment units above the first floor. It is apartment buildings and apartment units above the first floor of a retail use.
Well,
That's the way the ordinance is
That's a
written.
point of disagreement,
Well,
and I
we
think...
can disagree on that.
I
but
think
it's been very clear.
a legal reading of that, the conjunctive word means something.
And
And it-
also,
Excuse me, could I finish?
Let
I'm sorry, I
let
just-
Mr. Coakley finish, please.
The word, I mean, again, a rule of construction of a statute is to take into consideration all words of the statute. You just can't read those words and just exclude the word "and."
So then it would, if it was like you said, Mr. Renda, it'd be apartment buildings above the first floor of business buildings. That doesn't really make sense.
when this building was built, the property owner received a use variance to put a apartment building in this zone.
We have looked high and low for that information, have not been able to find it. And I think we've done it at Oprah, we've asked staff continuously about, can you find that file? I'm not sure that that's correct, but even if it's so, a building approved by a use variance is not a non-conforming use. A building approved by a use variance is a different character than a non-conforming use. A non-conforming use, by definition, under the land use law, is a use that becomes non-conforming by operation of law. And that's exactly the definition of non-conforming use. So if it was approved by a use variance, it's not a non-conforming use.
Okay.
And the Pulio case so holds.
Because if it were a non-conforming, if it were, or this board thought it was, then you'd go to 3. Any change in a non-conforming building, structure, use, or lot shall require site plan approval, notwithstanding the previous one that said, modest exterior renovations didn't require. And then finally, there is this wiggle room, item B, where it said, if the applicant could demonstrate that because of peculiar conditions pertaining to the land, the literal enforcement of this chapter is impracticable or will exact undue hardship, the approving authority may grant such exemptions and waivers as may be reasonable within the general purpose and intent of the rules.
So I have a question. There's a term that's thrown around a lot in the planning and zoning world. It's called a legal non-conforming use versus an illegal non-conforming use, which would have to be brought into conformance either by changing the use or granting a variance. How does that come into play with this argument? Because if it's a legal non-conforming use, it would still have to comply with zoning rules related to non-conforming uses.
Right. I'm not sure that it is, I don't know what the board's interpretation of that section of the schedule, which says apartment buildings. But if the apartment building, a standalone apartment building, is a permitted use in the zone, then it's not a non-conforming building.
Right. I was speaking more in terms of if it required and received a variance because it was non-conforming illegally, or because they wanted to build something that would otherwise be illegal and received a variance, then it would be a legal non-conforming structure.
I don't know if that's the
That
right
is
term.
exactly the law.
I call a use variance to be becomes a permitted use because of the use variance.
Right. I agree. Yeah, the case that I mentioned there, it says, although a variance has characteristics similar to both a permitted and non-conforming use, a use permitted by variance is clearly distinct. So it's not a permitted use, it's not a non-conforming use. But again, my principal argument here is the exception in this ordinance applies regardless of whether it's a non-conforming use or not.
Oh, I would disagree with that, although I think the wiggle room here in item B, because there is this exception, even if we said it were non-conforming, and I agree there's ambiguity here as to whether an apartment building, given the way it's worded, if you look at things logically, you could make the argument that apartment buildings are allowed in the B1 district. But to me, I think with the wiggle room and the the fact that otherwise minor exterior modifications would not need a permit. Just getting to the heart of the matter, I don't think they need to come back for a permit, but others might disagree because you may have a different interpretation.
Well, I have a question. My first question is, can we agree that the claim of safety is irrelevant to the application?
Can we agree that the claim of safety?
Yeah, that there's a safety issue. Can we agree that's not anything that we're discussing tonight? That's irrelevant to the application?
It's the motivation, but not relevant to the matter under consideration.
Okay. And I guess one of the issues is, if you like an interpretation tonight, are you going to like that interpretation the next time the issue comes up? That is, for example, if you say A1E takes precedence over 3, that's going to mean something for the future. And we don't know what that case is going to be, but you may not be happy with what you decide. I mean, I can't really see what would be gained in this particular case. Right off the bat, I can't see what would be gained by having a full hearing on this. What would we wind up deciding? That's how I approach it, but what happens in the next case?
Well, I think you'd have to, and I thought about that too. I think you'd have to use your judgment as to where it reaches in a, first you'd have to decide if it were non-conforming, but then also to the extent that it's beyond a minor repair. To me, I've seen Aura Manor, I've seen the little balconies. I don't consider it much renovation to remove those balconies in this particular case. And I can't imagine if they came before us asking for, in a formal hearing for this, that I'd have anything to say. It's just so trivial. And that's where I think some of the wiggle room with this item B comes in. And, again, people could disagree with me on it. If you disagree, well, they have to come back. And we uphold the zoning officer's ruling.
So are we implicitly deciding that a building which stands, which is otherwise non-conforming, but is there by reason of a variance, is a conforming building, so that we don't have to get into whether or not subsection 3 controls? I mean, and is that going to hurt us sometime in the future?
I would personally have a problem with saying a use that's a legal non-conforming is a conforming use. I would have a problem with that. And I don't think we need to go there with this particular request for an interpretation. In my opinion, this is, I'll give a little bit of background. In most cases where you've got a non-conforming use and you want to make a change to it, that change, if it makes it more non-conforming, that would require a variance. If it makes it less non-conforming, then it wouldn't typically. So if you've got a variance for a deck that's 300 square feet on the back of your house that goes into the setback, and you reduce the size of that deck, then you're making it more conforming, and you wouldn't need a variance to do that. If you wanted to, depending on the municipality, if you wanted to turn that deck into a room, that would increase the degree of nonconformity, even though it's the same footprint. It's arguable whether that applies here, but certainly if you wanted to increase the size of the deck, even by a couple of square feet, and that would be an expansion of an existing nonconformity, would require, in my opinion, a variance. This particular request for interpretation of the zoning regulations appears to be whether or not, from my perspective anyway, appears to be whether or not this use, or this, not the use itself, but the modification to the existing use, increases the degree to which either the use or the structure is in nonconformance. And I don't think by reducing its size and scope and putting in windows where there were doors does that. And therefore, I think that as a board, we could reasonably say that, no, this isn't something that requires a variance, and direct the zoning officer or the town engineer to go ahead
So,
and grant a
so you
permit.
would say that subsection 3 should be read as any change that increases the nonconformity in a nonconforming building shall require site plan
I-
approval. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
But it doesn't say that.
It doesn't specifically, but it's an interpretation. That's what we're being asked to do, is interpret. I certainly would rather interpret that
Gotta
way
Talk
than-
into the microphone.
I actually am. So I'd rather interpret that way than interpret in a way that says all previous zoning variances that were granted are legal uses that can be modified without us having to consider them. I think it's much trickier.
Maybe the board should, as a threshold issue, decide whether or not it agrees with the zoning officer's decision whether or not this is a permitted use or not permitted use. Just focusing on the apartment building aspect of the ordinance, because that may eliminate the non-conforming issue altogether. So if that could be decided first, then maybe that would make it easier for the board.
Could we hear the reading of the ordinance again?
Which part?
The one that we're referring to interpreting the construction of.
The
Here.
subsection E, is that what you're referring to? It says renovations, these are the exemptions, and one of the exemptions is renovations, repainting, or alterations to the exterior of a building or structure which do not involve any enlargement of the building or major structural change as determined by the administrative officer. That's the exemption.
I was referring to the one that's the and/or question.
That's in
That's
the-
section.
It says apartment buildings and apartment units above the first floor of business buildings. That's a permitted use in this zone.
Apartment buildings.
Apartment buildings and apartment units above the first floor of business buildings.
If I were just to read this as a matter of logic, I would say apartment buildings are permitted. It's amazing, in all these years, this hasn't come to my attention before. And you're telling me that just has not been the history here, that apartment buildings in B1 are not a permitted use?
Not a permitted use.
This is not a good way to word it, if that's the case.
I didn't word it.
Yeah, I know.
I think it reads that apartment buildings are permitted uses. I wouldn't know how else to interpret that.
Well, you could read it, and it sounds like that maybe the town has read it this way, or maybe wrote it this way, that you could read it, apartment buildings above retail use or commercial use are permitted.
How could you read it?
And a separate sentence would be apartments above a retail use or commercial use would be permitted. And by combining the two, the only proper way to write that would be apartment buildings and apartments above a retail or commercial use. So it could be interpreted either way in total proper English. In fact, if you wanted to make a distinction, you might put a comma between the apartment buildings and the and, just to say that they're admitted.
Look, I think it could go either way. Look, I'm gonna go with the zoning officer here because of his history here and his knowledge, although it is worded poorly, and there would be a more felicitous way to word this to make it clear. But what do you...
Can I just go back to my question and get an opinion on this about whether a dormitory use is the same as an apartment use? Because in our zoning, we permit dormitory use in the university zone. We call it out specifically. Dormitory use is a much more, I think, intense use than a traditional rental apartment use.
I
It
don't
carries
believe-
its own.
I don't believe this would fall into the category of a dormitory use.
Because?
It's my understanding these are individual apartments that are rented by Seton Hall to students. Is that correct?
I would say that's.
There isn't a cafeteria, there isn't
They
a...
have kitchens.
Do they have kitchens?
Yeah, they're in, I mean,
Right.
when it was
They
first
have-
built,
they
they
do
were
have
built as
kitchens.
individual apartments. So I believe, it's my understanding,
If somebody's gonna come up and talk, they've got to come up to the microphone,
it's my understanding
please.
that Seton Hall took over the property at some point in time, I don't know exactly when,
1990.
and then from that point forward, they've rented the apartment units to students.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you give here this evening is the whole truth?
Yes.
Please state your name and address for the record.
John Signorello, 400 South Orange Avenue, South Orange.
In what capacity are you speaking?
I'm the Associate Vice President of Facilities and Operations.
For Seton Hall, okay.
Yes.
Can you tell the board what the rental arrangements for the 30 units in that building?
These are different from dormitories in that they are apartments, they have kitchens, some are multiple bedroom apartments, and the difference is usually with a dormitory style, there's no kitchen in it, you can only use it during the school year. These apartments, we allow students to rent them on a 12-month basis versus the normal, 6 to 8 month basis.
And how many students rent a single apartment?
I don't have that number for you.
Susan, any guidance on that? I mean, am I just barking up the wrong tree here, or is there an issue?
No, I believe, I agree with what Sal has said, that I wouldn't interpret these to be dormitories, again, because there are individual independent units that have, if you look at your ordinance, a dwelling unit
Right.
is permanent residency, which could be a year, containing living, cooking, sleeping, and sanitary facilities for one housekeeping unit. And that can include, a family is not by blood or marriage. So it definitely would say, at least what the testimony is, as Sal thought too, that these are independent units with all of those component parts.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to get a couple of things out of the way, this Sal, for you. Is this a major structural change?
Major structural change?
Yeah.
I don't believe it is.
Okay.
I mean, it is
No, I
a
just
structural
want-
change, but it's not major, it's a facade change. And just getting back to the ordinance, although the section that's been cited, subparagraph E, which talks about renovations, repainting, alterations to the exterior of the building, if you go back to the beginning of that section under exemptions, it's site plan approval should not be required for any of the following. But then, that's under number 1, but when you get to number 3, it says any change to a non-conforming building structure or use or lot shall require site plan approval. I believe that section E, the intent of section E is if it's a structure, if it's a property that is a conforming use, a conforming structure in a zone that permits that type of use, minor alterations to the building can be done if they're not structural without having to go to the board for a site plan approval. I think where this situation comes in is under 3 because it is, and I disagree with the misinterpretation, and I understand there's a little confusion there, but it's, in my mind, it's clear that, the apartment building is not a permitted use in that zone. Now, but down to the next paragraph.
There's a definition of apartment building in the ordinance.
I'm sorry?
There's a definition of apartment building in our ordinance. It says a building designed and used for 3 or more dwelling units.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there's any argument but that this is an apartment building, at least from our...
You got to speak into the microphone.
From our standpoint, we're not contending it's other than an apartment building. We are contending what the ordinance says on its face, and we are also contending if Mr. Renda is correct that this was approved by a use variance, it is not a non-conforming use as a matter of law. And so that his argument fails because that's not the law.
I don't think that's what it means by any change in a non-conforming could still be a legal non-conforming use.
Not under New Jersey law, unfortunately.
Well, I'm only playing a lawyer right now.
That's all right. I'm sure counsel will help you.
No,
But
I agree that once you get the use variance, it's no longer non-conforming.
It's no longer non-conforming.
That's the way I've always interpreted it anyway. I've always read it to be. But I'm getting back to the initial interpretation by the zoning officer, which was apartment buildings in the B1 zone. And if you look at the definition in our ordinance about what an apartment building is, it's a building designed and used for 3 or more. So it would seem to me if it's a building designed for 3 or more residential units, then it wouldn't be on top of a commercial space. That's just what I'm thinking.
Are there any other nonconformities besides the one you raised, Sal?
It's a nearby apartment building.
Pardon me?
Mr.
You mean on
Cipriano,
this
is there
property?
any- Are there any nearby buildings?
The building next door.
No, I think what
No,
Mr. Adler's
I'm asking,
asking
are
is
there
if there's-
any other, you stated it was a nonconforming building because it's not above retail stores, basically. Are there any other nonconformities that you know of?
Uses of the property? No.
Nonconformities?
No, like setbacks or coverage or parking?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there may have been variances, other variances granted at the time that this building was approved. I don't know those. But what they're proposing to do doesn't change any of the site location. I would suggest that the board consider paragraph B in looking at this application. And I believe that, you know, it wouldn't be impractical, you know, for the board to consider this, you know, as something that the applicant can do. But I would caution the board in making the determination that this is a permitted use, even with the variance that was granted. As Mr. DeScala said, you know, this is a legal non-conforming use because of the prior approvals. I don't have issues with them renovating the exterior of the building, but I just have to go based on what is in writing here. And that's why their application. And the other work was approved for the interior renovations, upgrades, things like that to their systems and everything in the building. But based on my interpretation of this ordinance, that's what I went by. But I don't see any issues with them moving forward with these improvements, you know, as long as the board would agree that, you know.
So are you suggesting rather than determine the exact interpretation of the schedule, and rather than determining whether or not it's non-conforming, that the board could find that these changes are allowable under B?
I mean, I believe so. I mean, if you
Yeah.
agree, I would think they
would
would be
agree.
allowed.
That's
to-
a narrower-
you can-
That's what I've been saying.
Yeah, I
That's
think-
what I said all along.
I think what Mr. Adler said a while ago is really the summary, is are we ever going to get to a different conclusion if we have a full hearing on this? I mean, they're not changing the density of the use, they're not changing the number of units, they're not changing the mix of units. Essentially, they're renovating the facade. I appear in front of boards in other towns where every time you change something on the facade, it's a site plan approval. And it's an unbelievable burden on the applicant for something that's, unless you're in a historic district, is essentially, if you ask me, a waste of time. I mean, I think what this points out is yet another example of our zoning ordinance having exceedingly bad wording and putting Mr. Renda in a bad situation, because when I read that section, to me it means apartment buildings are permitted use.
Well, look, this will be in my letter.
Right.
to
That's
the
what I was
Board
going to
of
say. Let's put it in our
Trustees.
letter.
But, look, this is why I'm saying, this is the wiggle room I was talking about.
yeah.
Under peculiar conditions pertaining to the land, I think this is, somebody had the wisdom to think that there might be these sorts of situations. I think this is one of them. And we don't have to rule on whether it's, you know, non-conforming, conforming, or even whether apartment dwellings are allowed. We're allowed to kind of escape those decisions in this particular case, and I think we should escape those things and decide them at another time.
I
Yes.
agree.
Would you like me to read B, which is referenced by,
We have it right here.
Sure, go ahead, read it.
well, if anybody doesn't have it in front of them? The rules, regulations, and standards set forth in this Part 4 shall be considered the minimum requirements for the protection of public health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of the township. However, if the applicant can clearly demonstrate that because of peculiar conditions pertaining to his land or her land, the literal enforcement of this chapter is impractical or will exact undue hardship, the approving authority may permit such exemptions and waivers as may be reasonable within the general purpose and intent of the rules, regulations, and standards established by this Part 4. So I think you've got a lot of wiggle room there, and we've discussed, and in fact, the safety factor can come into our decision-making.
But then you're going to need, then I'd want testimony. That's why I wanted to get it out. I wanted to get it out of our deliberations, because just a piece of paper that says that there's a safety issue is not going to do it for me. That's why I wanted it out of our deliberations. I mean, if we can somehow bring it within B, we don't have to decide anything else, really.
Right. So I make a motion that we consider overturning the interpretation, and then it fits within the exception as in B.
Wait, you're overturning the interpretation, or B gives you the authority to allow the work to
Okay,
happen?
I'm sorry, you're correct, and that's important. We're not overturning the interpretation. We're saying that it falls within Section B as a exemption. In this case, I'm making a motion that this falls within Section B.
And I'll second that motion.
And Mr. Don,
Yes.
Mr. DeScala,
Yes.
Mr. Polipiano,
Yes.
Mr. Reeves.
Yes.
Mr. Adler,
Yes.
and Ms. Werwin.
Yes.
And thank you, Sal, for doing it the way you did it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So now we move on to the larger case at hand, and which is why I imagine most of the audience is here, is for Seton Hall's case at 425 Scotland Road, the former Mary Lawn property. And we're going to pick up where we left off. I think we finished with the architect's testimony last time.
We got a letter
Right.
that had some additional information.
Mr. Chairman, for the record, Kevin Coakley, law firm of Connell Foley, on behalf of the applicant. And just to recount where we were previously and...
Mr. Coakley, make sure you're really...
Yeah, I will, sorry. Where we are now, we started with the first hearing where we had Mr. Quinn, the engineer, and Mr. Garbini as the witnesses. Mr. Garbini came back to speak briefly at the second hearing on a limited matter. And last hearing was Dean Schulman, architect Michael Shatkin. We finished with him. And the plan for this evening is to call Mr. Signorello, who'll give some testimony regarding the condition and stabilization of the Graves house. Then Ms. Dolan, who is the traffic parking expert for the applicant. Then Mr. Signorello will come back and discuss the shuttle in more detail, perhaps, than Ms. Dolan. And then finally, Mr. Steck, the planner, will testify. And so that, I think, is what we planned for this evening.
Okay.
That's okay with you?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Signorello.
Yes, this is a new application. Do you swear affirm the testimony you give to this board is the whole truth?
Yes.
Please state your name and address for the record.
John Signorello, 400 South Orange Avenue, South Orange.
All right. Mr. Signorello, since the last hearing, did you, at my request in response to the board's request, go visit the Graves house again?
Yes, we did.
All right. And have you been there on a number of occasions?
Yes, I have.
All right. And what would you describe to the board as the present condition of the Graves house?
The present condition, as you know, the house has no electric service, no gas service. It was all slated for demolition. Most of the interior of the house has been gutted. The basement has been completely gutted. There's no furnace or heating system in the house any longer. Right now, they have temporary electric using extension cords from the school building to run the sump pump and dehumidifiers in the basement. In our last two inspections of the building, we also noticed they're starting to have a rodent problem in the house to the point that we actually couldn't make entry into the full house because of the rodent problem.
Okay. All right. Now, given that condition, assuming that Seton Hall were to buy the property and were to be advancing rehabilitation of the school building, how would it maintain the status quo as best as possible with the Graves House?
Well, the first thing we would do, we would make sure that the building skin and envelope is secure in terms of roof leaks, making sure all the windows are sealed, and eliminating the rodent problem if it still continues. We would also establish utilities back to the house, electric and gas service, mainly so that we could provide some sort of temporary heat in the home during the winter months. Also to keep the house dry during the winter months, not allow dampness to set in, and provide some heat to the building. We would provide some sort of burglar alarm system to keep the house secure. We would also continue to maintain the sump pumps and dehumidifiers that are in the basement to prevent any mold or flooding from occurring to the structure.
All right, and would you protect the house from damage during construction on the site?
Yes, I think we've already discussed that in some previous testimony. We'll probably put some sort of construction fence around the structure so that it's not damaged during the construction process.
Anything to add?
No.
All right, no further questions.
Have you been able to make a structural assessment of the building? Not just, I understand it sounds pretty grim, but are you able to determine at this point termite infestations or other things that might be, rise to a level of really serious structural problems?
Not in any detail. We have noticed in the basement that there has been structural issues in the past and that some of the beams have been repaired, but not to any great extent. This last visit, we thought we would make more of an extensive review of the building to look at it for stabilization and possibly future upgrades. But again, because of the rodent problem, we're not permitted to go through the entire house.
I guess you should tell us what the rodent problem is, because
Were these big rodents?
It's something of size, I would say. And the only way we determine that is just by what we found. There's some chairs in the house. They've been torn apart. We found an animal carcass in there, so we don't know whether it's a dog, a raccoon, but it's an animal of some size.
Right.
Has the current owner of
As a
the property
euphemism of high order, I'd say.
has the current owner of the property been notified about the rodent problem that
Yes,
you
on both
discovered?
occasions.
Okay, and have they done anything to address the issue? Because
Not that we can determine.
now that you've brought this to light,
Mhm.
the health department may need to get involved, and code enforcement may need to get involved, because this situation cannot continue.
I mean, every time we go into the home, there's a representative from the seller with us.
So who alerts the health? Do we alert them? Do you alert them?
Unfortunately, we will have to alert them that this issue exists.
Your office will?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you plan to have a contract with a pest control service, or?
Well, as part of the whole property management, we maintain a pest service on call for both all sizes of animal problems.
It's supposed to be an employee, not a contract?
No, it's an outside service.
Okay.
I just want to go back to my question about structural problems. Is there any indication at this point, or are you going to take any further steps to determine that the building is salvageable? I mean, I guess what I am concerned about is clearly the building has been poorly maintained.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly there are serious problems in the building. If one of the aspects of your application is a reuse of that building, which is, seen positively by the community, I don't want to have to find out a month after you buy it that you do a full inspection and say it's riddled with termites and cannot be saved.
We will look to make that assessment once we can gain access back into the house, at least to the greatest extent possible without doing any anything destructive to the interior.
Right.
So you don't know today whether or not the building is even salvageable, right?
Well, we know by just some visual observation that, there are walls intact. We know that probably the electrical system needs to be upgraded, the plumbing system needs to be upgraded.
Well, I'm not talking about upgrade, I'm talking about whether the building is salvageable.
I can't make that determination.
Okay. And I'm just, because I was there a couple of times and I missed them, where's the temporary electric coming from?
Between the house and the school building, you'll see orange extension cords stretching from one building to the next.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Other questions?
I have a couple.
Mr. Dom?
So, one of my interests is, I know that you don't have a plan for the inside, but beyond the sort of basic stabilization, is there any sort of program for fixing the outside of the house, restoring it, pointing of the stonework? I know the building has aluminum siding. Is the siding going to remain? Windows have been removed and been replaced sort of haphazardly. As Mr. Parlapiano hinted, one of the attractive things about this application is that there's a chance to save one of the most important houses in South Orange. So, to me, there's an interest in, and I'm not looking for you to give me an interior layout of the building, because I know that probably has to evolve, but I'd like to have some confidence that there's going to be something positive happening with the outside of the building that is going to achieve what you want as far as stabilization, but is also going to give the town something as part of your application to be able to use the campus. So that's where I'm headed.
Okay. I think we all have a common interest in keeping the appearance of the house the way it is. I don't think the powder blue aluminum siding will stay. I think in terms of the interior of the home, clearly the main level as you entry is the area that we want to bring back as per some of the pictures that we saw, the ballroom, the entry foyer, those type of things. The upper levels are clearly just subdivided rooms that were made into bedrooms and offices and larger gang-type restroom and shower facilities. So those upper two levels is probably where we'll see the most renovation in terms of university office.
But there's nothing that you're presenting at this time beyond sort of stabilization.
That's correct.
Okay. My fear is that stabilization could mean we have another old stone house on our hands, where we throw a blue tarp over the roof and we walk away and let the building crumble. And then we say, well, now the building's too far along to fix, so now we have to demolish it. That's my fear, quite honestly, because we watched the town do that for 10 years and destroy the old stone house by neglect. And I would very much be unhappy if this application was approved and then not even a month from now, but 10 years from now, that house was demolished because it wasn't taken care of correctly. Now, I know it hasn't been taken care of correctly for probably 40 years, but to me, you're taking on that responsibility as part of this approval if it's granted.
Yes, we are.
Other questions? Do members of the public have any questions? Is there a microphone? Oh, right up here. Yeah, is this microphone on here? I don't think it's, go ahead. Talk into it again.
Now you're good.
There you go.
Oh, okay. Hello. I'm troubled by one question, which is there's no determination on the part of the applicant as to whether this house can be preserved or not. And it seems as though that's a critical issue to this community. So I would suggest to the board that the applicant be required to make that determination. Because if you were to approve whatever they're requesting, absent the knowledge that they can actually renovate this house, and it turns out that they can't, then what?
Okay, not exactly a question, but a good consideration. reminder that we're asking questions right now of the testimony provided by this expert.
Could I convert that sentence or that statement into a question for the applicant?
Sure.
Do you plan on doing an engineer's assessment of the house that you can submit to the board before our final decision is made?
I think that could be part of our report, yes.
And if that assessment shows that the house is structurally sound or can be improved.
Okay, why don't you introduce yourself first, please?
Janine Bauer, 416 Clark Street. And if that report shows that the house either is structurally sound or can be made structurally sound, will Seton Hall accept a condition on its approval, if there is an approval, to do so and to maintain the house?
Will we accept a condition on our approval?
Yes,
I think
that
it's
is the
something
question.
we would consider.
Okay, we'll consider it.
We have other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next witness is Ms. Elizabeth Dolan, traffic consultant.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear affirm the testimony you give here this evening is the whole truth?
Yes, I do.
Please state your name and address for the record.
Elizabeth Dolan, D-O-L-A-N, with Dolan and Dean Consulting, 792 Chimney Rock Road in Martinsville, New Jersey.
Ms. Dolan, what is your profession?
I'm a licensed professional engineer registered in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in civil engineering, and I focus and specialize in traffic and transportation engineering.
All right, and have you been admitted as an expert witness or authorized to testify by various boards?
In over 200 municipalities throughout New Jersey, including South Orange.
Okay. I'd like to offer Ms. Dolan as an expert in the field of traffic, parking, and access from roadways.
As a traffic engineering expert, in a word.
Yes.
Do we have any questions for Ms. Dolan?
Well, she's appeared before, and we've accepted her.
Yeah.
I have no issues.
Okay, we recognize you as an expert.
All right. Ms. Dolan, did you submit 2 reports to the board?
Yes, 2 traffic impact studies, the first dated April 11, 2014, and then after receiving staff reviews and going through a few hearings and meeting with your planner and engineer, we revised the report and submitted it. The revision is June 19, 2014.
All right, and Mr. Chairman, that should be part of your package, hopefully. All right, Ms. Dolan, can you just give your general background of the property?
The site is located along Scotland Road with frontage within basically a block. We've got Vose Avenue parallel to Scotland, and Montrose and Stewart, the east-west roadways on the north and south of the site, respectively. Throughout the course of the other testimony, specifically from our engineer, you've heard there's the 2 buildings on the site with multiple driveways, 3 driveways currently on Scotland, 1 on Montrose, 1 on Vose, and 1 on Stewart.
All right, and the first task of your report was to analyze traffic conditions and how those conditions would be affected by the proposed project?
That's correct. We had met with the university representatives to gain an understanding of the proposed use at this location, and when we understood that there would be high activity during the typical commuter periods, Monday through Friday, we determined that the standard traffic engineering program would be to perform traffic counts from 7 to 9 and from 4 to 6:30 at the various intersections surrounding the site. And so those were conducted back in December of 2013 when we kicked off the project, specifically on Thursday, December 5th, and Wednesday, December 11th. I would note that weather conditions were conducive to commuting and traffic activity was normal at that time. One of the review comments asked about the temple across the street, which has a driveway just north of Stewart, which we included in our count program. We did confirm that they had daycare on that day. So by all accounts, traffic was normal and operating as would be expected on a day-to-day basis during those commuter periods. As I said, we counted each of the 4 intersections surrounding the property, and the peak hours varied a little bit based on a 15-minute difference here and there. But when we looked at the volumes between intersections, they were pretty close, so we balanced out the numbers between each of the intersections around the property to develop what are considered the existing base traffic conditions, the morning peak hour and evening peak hour traffic volumes that establish the existing conditions on the roadways surrounding this property and the two-way traffic flows on each of the 4 roadways, Scotland, Vos, Montrose, and Stewart. So that was the first task, was to establish those existing conditions. We did note heavy vehicle activity, bus activity, pedestrian activity during those counts as well, and all those factors are considered and explained in the report. We did go back and update the pedestrian counts at Montrose and Vos, which is the busiest pedestrian intersection because it's right next to the Mountain train station, and we did find that during nicer weather just a few weeks ago, we did have a little bit higher pedestrian activity than we recorded in December. But those findings don't change our results to any significant degree. And so that is, as I said, the existing conditions established through a series of traffic counts and observations at all 4 intersections around the property.
All right. And having done that, did you also include in your report what you expect to be the traffic generation of the proposed use?
Yes, and the revision that we talked about from the first report to the revised report in June changed those projections. We talked about the memo that's appended to my original report, and it's been discussed at the prior hearings, and that memo from Mr. Marconi shows the daily activity in terms of the classes, the class capacity, classroom capacity at the Mary Lawn site, and how the arrival and departure can vary from day to day because not everyone's taking the same classes as they would if this were, again, used as a high school where the students are coming for presumably an 8 o'clock or so start time and then dismissal at 3. Instead, we've got varying classes of varying sizes throughout each day of the week. And so the trip generation has a little bit to do with that, and considering the total staff, faculty population, as well as the number of student parking spaces that we've talked about at the past few meetings. We were asked when we met with the planner and engineer if there were maybe some comparable sites in New Jersey or nearby that we could go and look at to see if our trip projections matched what was happening at other locations. When we went back and met with Seton Hall staff, however, we found out that they weren't, in fact, comparable. There were a few sites that were suggested, one in Plainfield and one in Scotch Plains, but they're not comparable to what is proposed here at the Mary Lawn site, the consolidation of the medical programs. So we also had looked at data from the Institute of Transportation Engineers. That's our go-to source for projecting traffic volumes for new development. But when we look at the ITE's data for community colleges or colleges and universities, the trip projections are very low, much lower than what we used in our first report and significantly lower than what we used in our updated report. So what we looked at was the combination of the staff and faculty volumes as well as the maximum number of students that will be coming here by car. Throughout the past couple of hearings, there's been questions about who drives versus who may take bus or transit. We've been told that there are very few staff and faculty that use mass transit. They pretty much all drive. So the question becomes how many of them are going to arrive or maybe depart the Mary Lawn site during these peak hours that we're studying. And again, the focus of a traffic study is to look at the busiest hours because that's when the most driveway volume will be occurring, entering and exiting this site, and during all other hours the traffic would be lower. So during the morning peak hour, some of our ITE data would indicate that about 45% of employees arriving at a place of work arrive during the peak hour, and that about 45% would depart during the evening peak hour. For our original study, we had jacked that up to 65%, but in this analysis, we used 91 trips. That would be not only the 72 staff and faculty associated with the medical school, but also the 19 employees, the university employees who might occupy the Graves House. We've talked about that occupancy being related to the office area that is netted out of that building, and the ordinance ratio of one parking space for every 300 square feet. So when you take the 300 square feet and divide it into the building area, you could occupy that building, the Graves House, with 19 employees. So for the employee component, we had 91 trips during the morning peak hour and during the evening peak hour.
Which is what percentage? I'm sorry, you went from talking about percentages to a set number.
Well, it's the total. It would be 100%.
Okay.
So we, instead of using the 65% factor, assuming that 65% of those employees would come or go during the peak hours, we assumed that there would be 91, a total of 91 trips.
So for purpose of this traffic analysis, you were more conservative than normal?
More conservative than what we first looked at using ITE, and more conservative or higher than what we used in our first traffic study. The number of parking spaces that we've talked about for student use is 101. And that is going to be a controlling factor for the number of student vehicles that arrive and depart the site. How it's managed and how the parking passes will be assigned is still to be worked out, but it is the intent to have the shuttle system to transport students who don't have parking passes, allowing them to park on Marylawn, that they would then be shuttled between the main campus, where the new parking deck and additional parking is going to be provided, and the Marylawn site. So we know that the maximum number of students that will be driving would be 101, and again, we wouldn't expect them all to arrive or depart during the peak hours, but we did assume for this analysis 85%. And I think that's also very conservative or an over-projection when you look at some of the numbers in that color-coded memo from Mr. Marconi in the back of our report, because we wouldn't expect that many students necessarily to be arriving. But again, we're testing a worst case. We're trying to be conservative because there are so many unknowns. But we do want to make sure that in the event we have a little higher activity during the morning and evening peak hours, that that activity can be accommodated not only at our site driveways, but also at the adjacent intersections. So the employee component, the student component have both been inflated or increased over the original analysis. Also, we had data from the school indicating that there's 33 evening students, so we assume that all of them arrive while 85% of the daytime students are departing. And then finally, we added in trips to account for the shuttle. During peak periods, we're anticipating that there would be a direct shuttle between the main campus and the Marylawn site. So what we've done is include 4 inbound and 4 outbound shuttle trips per peak hour, looking at roughly a 15-minute loop and 1 to 2 shuttles. And Mr. Signorella will touch on the shuttle activity a little bit later. But that was built into the trip generation calculation. So what we've done is increase our morning and evening peak hour trip generation by 59 trips over what we had forecast in our original report, for a total of 184 driveway movements, that's inbound and outbound during the morning peak hour, and 217 driveway movements during the evening peak hour. So the trip generation was then distributed to the site driveways and to the adjacent intersections based on some of the plan revisions that are forthcoming and that we've agreed to based on staff comment and some of the comments at the last few hearings. The current configuration has 3 driveways on Scotland. The driveway closest to the intersection at the northern end of the site will be eliminated. It's too close to the intersection, it's not needed, and that will be completely eliminated. The middle driveway it forms part of a loop driveway in front of the Graves House. And at this time, it's our intention to keep that for inbound movements only, particularly to allow ready access to the parking spaces that are configured in front of the Graves House. But then the main driveway would be towards the southern end of the site, accommodating inbound and outbound movements. And then the other main driveway is going to be on Bose Avenue, again, a fully appropriately designed 24-foot two-way driveway to accommodate inbound and outbound movements. We are looking to relocate the driveway on Stewart a little bit further from the intersection, but at this time, the applicant is agreeing that that would be chained or gated off in some manner and only used for emergency response if needed. Similarly, there's an existing driveway on Montrose, and that would also be gated or chained off and only for emergency use if needed. So really, we're looking at two driveways primarily accommodating the majority of the site traffic to and from the Mary Lawn site. And when we looked at the roadway network and the existing traffic patterns that we recorded through our traffic counts, we developed an assignment pattern for inbound and outbound site traffic. We routed them through the intersections, we routed them through the site driveways, and came up with a series of future traffic volumes for the weekday morning and evening peak hours. We also built in a background growth factor to account for any ongoing area activity and changes in the travel patterns that might increase traffic volumes, whether or not the site is redeveloped. And that growth rate comes from NJDOT's database. So it's a rather standard forecast for putting together future volumes prior to the site being occupied, in this case by the medical school.
And at the suggestion of board staff, you did not include any traffic that would come from any other projects in the area, is that correct?
We talked about that when we had a meeting, I guess now it's a month or two ago. We talked about whether or not there were any specific developments of significant size that would generate traffic volumes at this roadway network that we're studying, and we agreed that there was nothing that specifically needed to be added to these intersections, and that the appropriate methodology would be to use NJDOT's growth rate, and that's a growth rate for this county, for the roadways throughout the county. So that was applied to develop the background growth rates.
All right, and after taking all of that information into consideration, did you come to any conclusions about how the roadway network would be able to handle the projected traffic?
We performed what are called level of service calculations, and in traffic engineering there is a grading scale, A through F, to describe how well an intersection movement operates. And A, of course, is at the top of the scale, meaning there's little or no delay. Level of service C and D are in the middle of the range, and that's typically where you find most satisfactory conditions in New Jersey locations. When you get down to level of service F, you're in need of improvements because you've exceeded capacity and what most people commonly refer to as gridlock, or just too much delay. We did analyze the intersections and site driveways surrounding the site and the site driveways that will serve the site, and based on the existing conditions, we've got one signalized, fully signalized location, that would be Montrose and Scotland, and then the rest of the locations are all stop controlled. I'm just looking for my figure. Figures 10 and 11 of our report show the individual levels of service for the various movements at the various intersections and driveways. And we're measuring and calculating all level of service D as in David, or better, during both the morning and evening peak hours, with or without the addition of site-generated traffic. The volumes on Montrose, Vos, and Stewart are relatively low. There's available capacity to accommodate the increase in traffic that may occur with the redevelopment of the Mary Lawn site. The heavier volumes are on Scotland, about 1,000 cars two-way during the morning peak hour, 1,100 during the evening peak hour. But when we add our site traffic, we find that our driveway movements will be at acceptable levels, again, C and D or better, and that the intersections nearby won't change in operational levels. They'll maintain their existing levels of service. So while it may seem like a lot of traffic, there is capacity to accommodate that traffic. And in this revision, we've inflated those volumes coming to and leaving the Mary Lawn site. So I think it's a very conservative projection of the activity that would be experienced on a peak hour basis, but the adjacent roadway system has the capacity to accommodate that.
All right. Now, did you also study the question of whether the proposed means of access are safe and reasonable?
Yes, and as I said, when we revised the report, we eliminated the use of the driveway on Stewart specifically, and we increased the volumes on what we're calling the two main points of access for the site, the main driveway on Scotland and the main driveway on Vos. The combination of existing volumes with growth and the Mary Lawn projections indicate that we will have acceptable levels of operation during peak hours. During all other hours, it'll be better than what we calculated for the peak hours. And the driveways are being improved to conform to recognized design standards. And specifically on Scotland, there will be a site triangle. Currently, now there's a hedgerow across the front of the property, and if you try and come out one of those driveways, your visibility along Scotland is limited. So we'll be providing site triangles at the driveways and the appropriate geometry to accommodate inbound and outbound movements.
All right, and the final aspect of your report deals with parking. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
All right, and do you want to explain to the board your views on whether the parking as proposed is adequate for the site?
Yes. When I first kicked off this study and met with staff and we started to talk about how this site was going to accommodate the activity, and at the same time scoping the traffic study, I did speak with Mr. Keller. And we both were in the opinion that the staff and faculty has to have parking. They under existing conditions, and as I testified and you heard at prior meetings, there's very few faculty or staff that use mass transit. And so the idea is to accommodate all of the faculty and staff anticipated at this location, which would be the 72 for the medical school and the 19 ultimate university employees that might occupy the Graves House. So that's 91 parking spaces that would be assigned. And so that those people are guaranteed a parking space because they are going to be teaching and working here with the recognition that there may be some activity between this site and the university. In addition, we wanted to have spaces available for any visitors, for security, so we allotted 10 spaces for those types of visitors and any other necessary space that might be available for someone who needs to come to this site that otherwise isn't here on a regular basis. And that leaves the 101 parking spaces, and we've talked about, is this an appropriate supply, and what is the appropriate supply? As some of you may recall, I was involved with the parking expansion for the main campus, and there is that parking that's available. There's no way that the Mary Lawn site can provide the parking to accommodate all of the driving students or anticipated driving students for the medical school. So that means that there has to be an assignment of spaces for these students, whether it's through a lottery or some type of it would be handled through the university's parking association or parking office. But those 101 student spaces would be allocated. Those students would be the only ones permitted to drive. We've talked about possibly having carpooling groups have more preference for a parking pass and so forth. And those types of specifics would be worked out through the university and their parking administration. But these are the ideas that we've talked about. We recognize there are limitations on street parking. Clearly that has come out of the train station and not wanting to have commuters parking on the streets, and I don't think the neighbors would want to have students or staff parking on the streets as well. So this has to be something that is managed by the university by limiting the number of student passes for the Mary Lawn site. And based on the site plan that we've developed, we've got 101 spaces, which we think makes sense to accommodate a portion of the students. We've tried to look at this in terms of some of the recognized ratios, the ratios we talked about at the time of the deck expansion, but regardless of the math that you put to this, the roughly 100 spaces will be available for those students. And beyond that, the shuttle has to be a dedicated shuttle between the site and the main campus, particularly during peak hours. And one of the site plan changes that we went through, I think before we initially submitted, was to designate a place where that shuttle can come onto the property to pick up and discharge the students so that it's not obstructing flow out on the public roadways, and that can all be accommodated right on site. So that's the theory behind the parking, but it certainly has to work with administration and the shuttle as well.
Right. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Mr. Descala.
When you were allocating the routes or identifying the routes of the traffic flows that are generated by the site, how did you determine what roads well, start with that, and what is the allocation, what percentage are coming from which direction?
I don't have my worksheets with me, but I can tell you that the majority of the activity was routed along Scotland because that's where the highest concentration of activity is, and that gives you direct access to the university to the south, and it's the major corridor through the area. So we had the majority of the traffic. The highest volume of coming to the site was a left in, so as you're coming up
From South
from the
Orange
south,
Center.
from South Orange. The highest movement we had, it was into the site as a left turn, and a comparable volume, I'd say, coming southbound on Scotland and into the site via a right turn. We also had lefts and rights over on Vos Avenue, with a smaller amount coming from the south. That would be the lowest percentage overall, and then some from the north as well. So the highest assignment was to the north and south on Scotland.
And is this based entirely on existing traffic flow?
For the most part, we looked at the existing traffic flow. We looked at the the route, obviously, to and from the school,
Right.
and the accessibility. Scotland is the major collector roadway through that area, so we would expect that to carry the majority of the activity.
So there's no assumption is made about where the trips would be originating, basically. So you said mostly all the faculty would be driving. Where those faculty and staff are living, originating their trips from, isn't taken into consideration.
When we met with Mr. Keller and Ms. Gruhl, we talked about some of that data collection and whether or not that data is available. And when I went back and met with university staff, it's not available, not to the degree that
You would have to make assumptions, right?
Well, sure, and a traffic study is not. There are some assumptions based
Right.
upon the data that we have and recognizing the roadway system and where it leads to and from. So, but we didn't take hard data from where the students live, or because that was one of the things we did look at, and I don't know if it was submitted or testified to, but there was some data regarding how many students are from in-state, out-of-state. But that data was their official place of residence. It has nothing to do with where they live now that they're attending Seton Hall. So they may be an apartment in South Orange, they may be an apartment in another municipality outside of the area. So it is based on some assumptions, it's based on the roadway system, it's based on the traffic volumes that we collected.
Right. So if I were to do this analysis, I might make some assumptions about the fact that this is a graduate school, that these students aren't living on campus. Some percentage of them I try to identify are living in town, but the rest would be coming from points outside of town. And how would they get there? Be it 78 or 280, and then how they would get from 78 or 280 to the site.
And again, where they're coming from, where they're going to, is largely influenced by the commuter patterns on the roadways, which is a function of what we counted. So that's how we looked at the assignment. I can tell you that if we change the assignment a little bit, it wouldn't change the results of the study. For example, one of the things we looked at is if you have a high number of lefts turning directly out onto Scotland Road, which is the highest volume roadway, what will the level of service be? We calculated a D, but someone could just as easily go around the block and make the left at the traffic signal if they're headed to the north. So there's all sorts of different driver preferences that come into play as well.
Right.
But I can tell you that if we shifted the distribution around a bit, it's not going to change the results of the traffic study to any significant degree. We could put a lot more traffic out on the Vos Avenue side. There's very low traffic volumes back there, so we could add up a lot of traffic back there and pretend that nobody's going to try and make a left out onto Scotland. But I think what we tried to do was represent a very fair forecast of the driveway movements. But certainly There's all sorts of individual preferences, and where someone parks on the site. If there's more parking towards Vos, well, maybe there will be more entry and exit movements off of Vos. But if I take my traffic and move most of it over to Vos, I'm going to calculate acceptable levels because the volumes on Vos are much lower than they are on Scotland. So it's, I think, a very fair representation of what would be a high, in this particular example, the left turn out, which is a sensitive movement. Left turns are the hardest to make, but there are options to, as I said, go around the block. And I also feel that the elimination of the driveway on Stewart is fine. There's really no reason for people to exit to that location. We've got plenty of capacity on the two frontage roads, access roads, to allow this traffic to come and go. And so, yeah, there may be lots of variation in how we assign the traffic, but at the end of the analysis, I don't believe we're going to be changing the traffic characteristics on the roadway to any significant degree.
The signal timing on the intersection of Montrose, West Montrose and Scotland is, actually it's Montrose and Scotland, in my opinion would be an area for concern because you've got a very long red for the side street and a very short green for the side street. I've timed it myself and it looks like it's about 90 seconds red and about 6 seconds green.
Yeah, then the county will give the majority of time to their roadway, but I think we do have a county level of approval on this application as well. We didn't notice any need to change the traffic signal timing in our analysis, but if there were, for example, what we talked about, more people going around the block and using that left,
right,
then there might be reason to reevaluate that signal timing.
Right. I mean, I think it's an area for concern because I know existing conditions will cause a queue of longer than 4 or 5 cars that cars beyond that point will have to wait through 2 red cycles. And if you have increased traffic at that intersection, then so you haven't identified that as an area of concern based on the analysis that you've done, and you don't recommend necessarily a change in signal timing.
Not at this
location.
time, but as I said, we still have to go through a county application, and if that were to be a higher used approach, which it could be during the, I would say probably the afternoon peak hour, then that might be something we want to investigate with the county.
Okay. That's all I have. I'll let other board members ask about parking.
Can I just take you back to the parking side of it? I was unclear about your testimony on the 101 student spaces. How will those passes be assigned?
I don't know how they'll be assigned.
So if you don't know how they're going to be assigned, how can you do a traffic assessment? And I'll lay out the scenario. If the university decides to go for contended access to parking and issues passes to whoever wants them and says, come to site, see if you find a spot. If you don't, head over to Seton Hall, park, get on the shuttle, and come back, then the amount of traffic on the site would be much higher than you're assuming, because you're assuming, I think, in your study from what I read, that only those with passes would come and that they would fit, right?
Yes.
But in the other scenario, contended access scenario, people would come, would circle around, wouldn't see a spot, would say, maybe in 5 minutes, they'd circle a little more, they'd idle, they'd sit in the parking lot, they'd sit on the street, and they'd wait, and they'd do a couple of rounds, the way I do in a crowded parking lot, before they'd give up, at which point they would do something else. And the traffic impact would be vastly different. And I'm wondering how you can do a traffic study if you can't answer that question.
Well, when I was asked to participate in the Mary Lawn project, it was after working on the parking garage expansion for Seton Hall. And what I learned during that application and what I saw in my visits and what I heard in the public forum was exactly what you're describing. Students are coming to the site, they can't find a place to park, they're parking out on the public right-of-way, there's recirculation.
Or they're idling and circulating. Well, we heard all that testimony.
And they're parking illegally on the school property. And so when we started the Mary Lawn project, I said, you can't issue the kind of permits that you've issued on the main campus. And I know we talked about it here through my testimony on the garage, or on the parking deck site, was that there are more passes issued on main campus than there are parking spaces. We cannot have that here. We don't have or want recirculation. We don't have parking on the streets, we have residential neighbors, we have a commuter parking lot across the street. And so my suggestion in having the initial kickoff meetings with the group was, if we're going to have students park here, we have to set a number, and that number has to be the number of passes. We can't give out more. And I think even at the last hearing a month ago, someone asked about trying to give out passes based upon the students who might be there on, let's say, Tuesdays and Thursdays versus the students who might be there Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And we thought that that would be an overwhelming task, and that would lead to the concern that you're raising, which is you can't give out more passes than there are spaces.
So you're making the argument for why the right choice is only to give out 101 passes and no more, but your testimony is that has not yet been decided.
No, I don't. I think you're misunderstanding her testimony.
I'm not misunderstanding.
No, right in her report, at page 14, it says no more than 101 student parking passes will be issued, so as to ensure there is no overflow parking off-site. So it's not going to be more than 101 parking passes for this site.
So that is your testimony now, that it's only 101?
101, I thought you had asked me how that was going to be administrated or overseen. I don't know the specifics of that, but it is that 101 student spaces will be available, and therefore 101 student passes would be given for parking at the Marylawn site.
And that'll be it?
Yeah.
And so on a given day, how many students will not be able to park on campus? What's the total actual load on that site?
Well, I think the magic number was 365 is what we maxed out at any one time, number of students who might be there. So
right.
If you take the 365 minus the 101, you're in excess of 200 students who'd be looking to use the shuttle and park on site. Again, assuming no credit for mass transit, we do have the train there, but if you're looking strictly at the parking as it relates to the student population, I think that's your the high number that's been testified to.
Right. And in fact, if you only assign 101 passes, and through some quirk of statistics, on a given day, none of those 101 are actually coming to campus, then the parking lot's empty. And in fact, you've got 350 students coming over on the shuttle. Is that correct?
Well, for that peak load on that one day, sure. But if no one was parking, then presumably the 100-some-odd students who might be parking wouldn't be part of that 300 number.
Now, so the 300 is the classroom capacity, the seat capacity of the building. And we've had testimony about, how the classes lay out against those classrooms and where you are. The dean last time testified in detail about where the enrollment is relative to the number of seats. And the way I would characterize that testimony is you're pretty close to capacity in most of those classrooms, a little room for growth. And really, I think the key from his testimony was not a lot more growth because I don't have the classroom seats. Right? And so at most times, the dean's testimony was the classroom seats would be pretty much filled, right? And so, the students, maybe the students who are in the physician assistance program somehow all got the 101 passes. Today is not a physician assistant classroom day, so the parking lot would be empty. And yet the classes would be full.
But we also don't know how many of those students were coming earlier in the day to maybe have an earlier class or to meet up with staff or faculty or to meet up with other students to perhaps study or work on some group projects, and we don't know how long they're staying. And that's why there's so many variables involved here that it can be overwhelming.
Well, I guess, my reason for going down this line is to understand the shuttle capacity you've spoken about. So your testimony was that you assumed 4 trips per hour. If we have if 8 o'clock is the beginning of the day and the classrooms are pretty full at 8 o'clock or at 9 o'clock, then somehow you're going to have to move hundreds of students from Seton Hall's main campus across to the Marylawn campus. And I'm wondering what size buses you're using and how many trips that really would be.
Okay, and Mr. Signorella is going to talk about that in more detail. But I just want to go back to one of the things in my later report. Because when we looked back again at the color-coded summary of activity, For the purposes of this analysis, reference is made to the Tuesday schedule for the morning peak hour arrival. The table shows that 268 students could arrive during the morning peak hour, which is approximately 50% of the student population. So that would be the number that we looked at as the highest arrival during the morning peak would be 268. And then for the
Well,
purposes...
sure, but if you look at the next block, it's 348.
Right.
So I'm, in terms of the parking, so in terms of the parking load, I'm not sure, I mean, you're right, maybe at that moment, the parking, the parking or the shuttle load would be 268. An hour later, it might be higher.
Right, and I think that as I had said, the analysis assumes a heavy inbound arrival activity during the morning peak hour and a heavy outbound arrival, assuming that we do have all of those kids driving, those students driving. I shouldn't say kids, they're graduate students, but the over projection would certainly account for any more shuttle trips that are made in the event that those student parking trips aren't made.
But just take me, I understand that, but take me back to your statement about 4 shuttle runs per hour in the rush hour. Is that based on the size of the van and the number of students expected, or is that just a pie in the sky?
That was based upon a timing to travel between points A and B, main campus and Marylon, and to allow time for students to get on and off the bus. So that loop essentially could be made, best case, 4 times in an hour, once every 15 minutes. There's a possibility there could be 2 shuttles doing that, and maybe it would be 16. I don't think if you had 16, it would make any difference to the study, again, because we've brought those numbers so much higher. But as to the specifics of the size of the shuttle, how many seats, how many drivers, how many per hour, that analysis has not been performed by my office.
Okay. Did you do an analysis of the street parking that's available around the site?
I did an inventory of the parking, but I didn't do any counts of how much was being used, just an inventory of the restrictions that are posted.
Right. Can you take us through that and then whether you considered that or not in your parking analysis?
Okay, on Scotland Road, parking is not permitted. On Vos and Montrose, there's 2-hour limitations. I think it's Monday from 9 to 6. Just trying to get the right. And then on Stewart, it's parking only in the mornings. I think it's on page 3 or so of the report. Parking is not permitted along Scotland. And on Montrose and Vos, it's 2-hour parking, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., except Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. On Stewart, no parking, 7 a.m. to 11 a.m., Monday through Friday.
So after 11 a.m., you can park on Stewart?
Yes.
Without time restriction?
Correct.
How about the streets across Scotland Road coming further up? So these would be areas, we normally think about street parking in terms of the distance that a person would be willing to walk, right? And in this case, if I had to choose between walking 2 blocks versus driving to Seton Hall, going to the parking deck, waiting for a shuttle and coming back, I'd probably be willing to walk 4 blocks or 5 blocks versus that because it would be faster, right?
Yeah.
So did you look at concentric circles and look at parking further out than just the immediate?
I did not. I looked along those roadways immediately adjacent to the property.
And is I guess just from a common sense point of view, I would do what I just said, which is if I came to campus or if I was coming and I didn't have a pass or whatever the situation is, I would certainly look around before I headed to the deck and to wait for the shuttle. Is there a reason you didn't look at that?
Because I don't think it's practical, and I think that recognizing the parking prohibitions immediately adjacent to the property, you can't park on Scotland north and south of the site, but I didn't go further into the neighborhoods to look at that. I think that if someone's coming to this site, they're going to have in their initial information package whether or not there's parking facilities, and you get maps and information about what's available and what types of accommodations or amenities there may be on the property. I know there were questions about, will there be a cafeteria? Will there be coffee shops and those types of things? So certainly when a prospective student is looking to come here and they're a driver, they are going to be looking into that well in advance of their first 8 o'clock class, I would think. So while there may be some students who might want to look for a place to park, I don't think that it's going to be readily available. I can certainly go back and look at all of those, but the goal and the focus here is to provide parking to those 101 students that we can allow to park on site, and otherwise offer a convenient and effective shuttle between the two sites so that the capacity of the new deck can be used by these students, where we know we have now available parking to accommodate them.
We had testimony in the parking deck case from yourself and a number of other people from the university about the problem of students overflowing into the community around the campus because there wasn't adequate parking. We had testimony about parking illegally on campus because there wasn't enough parking. And so, we have testimony, and frankly, we have the reality that we've all seen in the town, right? We've seen this, that in fact, whatever, I'm sure the regulations for the main campus have always said, don't park illegally on campus. I'm sure they've always said, follow the restrictions on the streets around the campus. And yet, when there was a crunch, students used every available place they could find to put a car. And that was a big motivation in the approval, in the application for an eventual approval of the deck, was to say you must have enough capacity so when students come, they can absolutely expect they'll drive onto campus, they'll make their route, they'll find a space to park, and they won't be pushed off site. And so I'm curious about why you would not have looked at this as an issue that would be generated at a site where there's going to be such restricted parking.
Well, I absolutely did look at it as an issue.
But you didn't look at it in terms of kind of walkable distances. And as I said, I think if you took any student and said, here are your options, get a parking pass, oops, didn't get that, come park on campus and wait for the shuttle, or park 2, 3, 4 blocks away and walk, they're going to look at the 2, 3, 4 blocks away. There's some, I don't know what that distance is, but there's some distance from that site that people are going to, word of mouth's going to get around, hey, you can park on, blah, 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 and there's usually a space there, and people are going to learn that.
Just the way they can do that for New Jersey Transit now, and the municipality also has the ability to post and approve new on-street parking prohibitions. So from my perspective, it was very important to limit the number of student passes, because many of the problems that we've just been talking about on main campus and surrounding main campus are the result of more parking passes than there are parking spaces. And that's proven to be a real problem,
right.
And cause obviously a need for more parking on site and another look at how the parking passes are distributed. At this particular location, I certainly didn't want that. The university doesn't want that, and that is why we are proposing to limit the number of student passes to the number of available parking spaces for students after all staff and faculty have been assigned spaces.
Okay. Your testimony is that staff and faculty must have parking on site. Given that they are on a, given that they're paid to come to work, as opposed to pay the university to come and take classes, why couldn't they park in the new deck and take the shuttle, and there be a faculty shuttle that leaves at 8, to get them there on time, or the Graves House? Why is their convenience more important than the students' convenience?
Well, I think, number one, because of the uncertainty of who would ultimately occupy the Graves House, we wanted to assign 19 spaces for them. Based on my understanding of some of the operation for the medical school, and I think you heard testimony from the dean that there will still be some labs for the faculty on main campus, that there may be some activity with the staff traveling between the two locations. Also, there's virtually no staff using mass transit at this time. So that was the thought at the start of the project, and we've planned it that way all along to accommodate the anticipated staff and faculty. That's not to say that they couldn't use the shuttle. I don't think we've really thought about it in that from that perspective. We've thought about allocating the parking for the staff that we anticipate being there on a somewhat regular basis, and what's left over would be for those students who would qualify for the pass.
Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to just follow up on what Mr. Polipiano was questioning, because I've been thinking about the testimony that we got last month. And to me, the 100 parking passes for students, the only way it works logistically for Seton Hall is that you only issue 100 or 101. Because the logistics of over-issuing put us into the same situation that we would have on campus. But I don't understand how that makes any sense, because you're giving one parking pass out for every 5.5 students that are in the college. So essentially, 1 out of every 5 or 6 students is getting a pass. But like Mr. Polipiano said, there may be days when only 40 of those spaces are being used just because of the way the scheduling works. That doesn't seem to be, on the other hand, it doesn't seem to be a very efficient way to get the maximum use out of that parking lot. Now, I don't know that there actually is a way to get the maximum use out, but it just seems to be a very odd way to go about assigning those parking spaces. I know it's the way that you can guarantee that there'll never be more than 100 cars, but it just seems to me that there'll be very little time when all those spaces are actually used, just because of the way the schedule goes.
And we did take a look at that after, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, after the last meetings, where someone said, could you maybe look at the schedule and allow the Tuesday, Thursday students to have parking passes for those days, and the Monday, Wednesday students to have parking passes for those days. And I think it would be an administrative, a high administrative task to get a level of comfort with that type of assignment. So as you said a moment ago, the idea of guaranteeing the spaces are never double booked is the theory behind this, is that there's a parking supply there. We can accommodate the employees.
Could you turn that off, please?
We've looked at limiting the supply simply because I think it would be too difficult to guarantee that you wouldn't at one point have a doubling up because of the variation in the schedules.
Yeah, I also think that Mr. Polipiano's point about people parking elsewhere is a very valid point. I mean, I live in that neighborhood, and there are no parking restrictions other than you can't park between midnight and 6. So unless the town is going to re-sign those areas, I think the area is ripe across Scotland Road on the side streets for people just to park for the day. So I think it's a real possibility, knowing that that's only a 2 or 3 block walk. It's a very easy walk.
Well, that's a guarantee.
I guarantee it. So.
And my point is that if you put these variables in there, it raises the question of the basis of your traffic study, because your traffic study is based on a totally controlled, pristine environment where the maximum cars from students that come to site is 101, period, end of story.
Right.
And I think that's an idealized condition, but it is not what you are going to see in practice if the site was to operate this way.
And that's as I said, my error for not evaluating what is now a lack of parking restrictions on those other streets. In my thought, if this location is occupied with the medical school and the restrictions, for example, the one on Stewart does allow afternoon parking. I'm not sure why that one's different, but it almost seems to me that the governing body might want to change that if the medical school occupies this site, so that you do guarantee that you don't have student parking there.
That's right. I mean, you could turn that residential neighborhood into an area that has very strict parking restrictions, so that when someone comes over to have lunch with you, they can't park in front of your house, right?
Well, that's I think the 2-hour.
That is at the heart of the question that we have to evaluate of the impact on a residential zone of this use. Right? And that's why this question is so important. And so I just think there are serious questions about the parking assumptions, about the behavior of individuals and how they'll act given these rules. And then it just, for me, says I don't know what to do with your traffic numbers, because I think they're based on idealized situation but not reality.
But they're also inflated when you look at the arrival and departure patterns that typically are experienced at places of work. and also at schools. And as I said, if we looked at some of the ITE data for this type of institution, the numbers that would be forecast would be, in my opinion, unrealistically low. So I've tried to err on the high side, recognizing that there are some changing patterns at the school day to day, and there are some unknowns, and we're trying to look at this from a conservative perspective, which may take into account some of that. But as for the recirculation and searching for a parking supply, the recommendation at the onset of this project was to limit the number of student passes. But I agree that if there is parking permitted on some of these other streets, that students may find that, yes.
Mr. Adler?
Yeah. Not being cynical, but couldn't you have no parking spaces for students and have them all come by shuttle and have much less problem?
Well, I suppose you could, as long as, again, there were those potential parking locations eliminated from the search by those students by putting up other parking prohibitions. But if there were no parking, then, right, you'd reduce the trip generation potential for the site.
Or you'd increase the incentive of students to be creative in finding places to park,
That's a
which
problem.
is my concern.
You indicate, by the way, what's the peak hour in the AM and what's the peak hour in the PM? I didn't see that. I didn't notice it.
Right, it's because it varies from intersection to intersection, but I think overall it was close to 7:30 to 8:30. And I don't recall in the afternoon, it was probably 4:30 to 5:30, 4:45 to 5:45. But because it varied from intersection to intersection by 15-minute intervals, I didn't call it out individually. I can certainly provide you that for each of the intersections. I don't have those data sheets with me now, but you know, it's something I can provide.
Do you have any idea why it varies 15 minutes from intersection to intersection?
Well, sure, because we count on 15-minute increments. We count every 15 minutes from 7 to 9 and from 4 to 6:30. And to determine the peak hour, you take the 4 consecutive 15 minutes.
Right.
So the way the traffic flows into and out of the intersections, even though they're all close to one another, there's still a variation, and so you may have a 15-minute offset from one location to the next. But as I said earlier this evening, when you look at the volumes, for example, on Scotland Road between Montrose and Stewart, they were pretty close. So even though there may have been an offset, there were, that's sort of a check we do, is when we count contiguous intersections, we look at the flow between them to make sure that all the numbers make sense. But the offset is just simply a function of counting every 15 minutes and isolating the absolute highest that occur in the 4 15-minute consecutive periods.
I would just like to echo the sentiment that I think that limiting, if this was to go forward and we were to hash out all the relative issues, that limiting the parking pass distribution to 101, I don't think it's reasonable for us to predict that that would last, or that the students would find it reasonable. But, and I do think that it's reasonable to say that they should be distributed based on the classes. From my watching of the video, I saw that the classes, that the students start together and they end together, and that they're going on these certain days. And I think that students would be furious if there was 40 open parking spots, and there would be a tremendous pressure on the school to change the way that they hand out the passes. So I don't find 101 passes to all students a believable long-term solution. And just as to comment on what Mr. Parlapiano said, I don't think that offering that the residents have greater restrictions on their parking is anything I would be close to comfortable with as a solution either, that the town take it into their own hands to address that.
Mr. Chairman, I had questions. Your report had a 60-second interval at the signalized intersection for the Cyclone Montrose. Where did that number come from?
From timing it in the field.
From
timing it with a stopwatch.
Okay, and Mr. DeScala, therefore, must be wrong when he says it's 90 seconds? Did you do it, or did someone else? do it?
Someone from my office did it. I didn't do the timing.
Doesn't the county that put that in have the right number?
Yeah, we could request the official timing directive from them.
Would the change in the timing of that signal change any of your conclusions or any of your charts?
It would change potentially the levels of service. Those calculations would have to be revised with any different signal timing, and the results may be a little bit different from what's presented in the report that's submitted. But that would be, we would rerun that analysis with any changes to the red and green allocation and the total signal cycle.
And how did the manual turn counts get done?
By placing staff at each of the intersections, and they count each left turn, right turn, and through movement at each of the intersections that we studied, and they count and tally every 15 minutes.
How many staff did you have at each of the intersections?
At each intersection, one person.
So you had one person counting all of the traffic going through an intersection and which way they were turning and which direction they were coming from?
At the intersection of Scotland and Montrose, the signalized intersection, there's 12 movements, so they count all 12 movements.
And one person does that?
Yes.
Is that standard?
Yes, and that's a pretty low-volume intersection. They count much busier intersections with multi-phase traffic signal control, and this is, by all accounts, something I would call an easy count. And certainly, of all the study locations that we performed these manual counts, that would be the busiest intersection and the one with the most movement. So all of the other locations were also one person, and they counted up the 6 or maybe there were 8 movements or so. Or when we counted Stewart, we also counted the Temple driveway, so they got all the movements at at that offset intersection.
Is there a margin of error that you calculate?
I'm sure there's a margin of human error because you have to, you're clicking and you're watching, but the staff that we have doing this is what they do, and we've trained them to do it. And as I said, even though we had different staff at the 4 locations, or they were done on different days, when we looked at the morning peak hour and evening peak hour volumes from intersection to intersection, they closely matched. And so that gave me a high level of comfort that the numbers were solid.
They closely matched by how much? How much were they off?
I don't have those raw worksheets with me, but it's certainly something I can provide.
You didn't support these counts with video at all?
I'm sorry, with video? No.
And you testified to 4 inbound and 4 outbound shuttle trips in the peak hour, and then you said maybe it would be 16, if I got that right. How many would there be in the off-peak hours?
Again, I haven't done any analysis on an off-peak hour basis. The focus of the traffic impact study was these 2 highest volume hours. And I don't know, I know Mr. Signorella is supposed to testify later or at the next meeting on some more specifics of the shuttle, so I don't know if he can provide that information, but I don't have any information about that.
You have other questions, Mr. Adler?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
You said there are 10 spaces for visitors. What kind of visitors?
I suppose a prospective student. I don't know if, for any reason, maybe faculty would have a meeting with someone. I really don't know. But the idea was to reserve about 10 spaces for that type of non-anticipated parking demand.
And how about anticipated visitors, such as the models that the students use to practice their clinical skills on?
I don't know if that's considered in that visitor count, and maybe a representative from the university could better answer that. But when we were looking at the allocation of the student parking, the number that the university came up with was that 10 would be appropriate for visitors, and I think security was the other user identified.
Now, on page 6 of your revised report, you said that there is limited future growth possible. What did you base that on? And that's a change from your earlier report.
Based on the dean's presentation at the last meeting or the meeting before, where he went through, I think, some specifics of the different areas of study and accreditation and whether or not there was room to possibly have a few more students. So I did change it from no growth is expected to limited growth may occur.
And what would that limited growth be?
Well, I think he said 2 to 4%.
So that's what you meant when you wrote this down?
Yes.
Okay. And on that same page, you say it's expected that the 72 medical faculty and staff will arrive in the morning and stay through the course of the day. And is that your understanding that the teachers will be on site all day?
I think there was some testimony at a prior meeting that there may be some back and forth, and I testified to that earlier, that that's my understanding now, having sat through some of these meetings, that they may travel between the Marylawn site and the main campus.
Other than traveling to the main campus? In other words, how many courses, how many hours a day are these instructors teaching?
Well, I guess that would depend on which classes that they're teaching. I don't know the exact mix of which professor might teach one or a few of some of the classes in a particular curriculum. So I don't know. But the theory behind calculating peak hour arrival and departures was to assume that most of that staff's going to come in the morning peak hour, and then most of it's going to depart the site during the evening peak hour.
And which part of the ITT trip generation document?
It's just a trip generation manual.
Manual gives you the numbers that you are using.
Well, I didn't end up using them in the revised report. The part of the manual that I originally referenced in the first traffic study was from the office use, where there was employee activity, arrival heavy in the morning and departure in the evening. And that percentage from ITE is about 45% of the people arrive during the peak hour and depart during the peak hour. Because some people get to work at 7, some people get to work at 8, some people get to work at 9. So there's a gradual inbound progression during the morning, and the same thing with departures in the evening. So, but the ITE shows that about 45% of the employees at an office are arriving during the peak hour. That's the concentration of activity.
I'm sure that's right. As someone who's been in business and in offices, it's not right. I mean, 45% of the people don't come during the peak hour. 90%, I'm taking a guess, 90% come during the peak hour. So I don't quite understand why my experience, which is probably wrong, is so different from what the manual says.
Well, again, and that's for a professional office of varying sizes in the database that the ITE has, and that's what the average turns out to be. I thought it was a little light, particularly considering that this isn't an office use. Maybe the Graves House will be office use, but we're really talking about a school. And so that's why in the first report I used 65% to account for more inbound in the morning and outbound in the evening. And this time I jacked it all the way up. I mean, I did assume that there would be a small departure during the morning and a small arrival during the evening peak hour, but overall I inflated it to the total 91 trips to account for the 72 at the medical school and the 19 at the Graves House.
And how about the non-peak hours? Does it say how many trips are generated?
No, the ITE manual, there's a few land uses where they may give you hour-by-hour breakdown, but for the most part, all of the data focuses on the peak hours in the morning and in the evening, the peak commuter hours, or for certain uses like retail uses, then on a Saturday midday. But they don't provide data for the off-peak hours for most land uses.
Do they provide number of trips for a whole day?
Yes, that they do. For most land uses, they'll have a 24-hour trip rate.
And is that reflected anywhere in your report?
No, because as I said, the only ITE number that I used was that arrival and departure percentage. I didn't use any of the actual ITE rates for these reports. And the data that they do have for community, college, or college and university would have been, I think, not appropriate to apply to this somewhat small campus of a specific nature. So, because they would have produced trip numbers that were unrealistically low, in my opinion.
Well, those trip numbers, regardless of the size, are per, for example, employee or per student.
Yes.
So, I mean, there may be some variation in the size of the facility, but still it's per student or per employee.
Right. Those are the variables, the independent variables for which there are trip rates.
And so do we know what the trips per student and per employee would be?
If you can give me a minute, I've now got that paper here somewhere. I have numbers for, this is the ITE 9th edition trip generation manual. They have a land use category that's called a junior or community college, and then they also have college and university. If we look at the student population, 560 students, during the morning peak hour, the junior community college would yield 68 trips, and the college and university rates would yield 96 trips.
Well, I mean for the whole day.
For the junior/community college, 688.
Based on 560?
Yes, based on 560. And for the college/university, 958.
I'm okay for now.
Okay. I'd like to take a break at this point and come back and continue testimony. 10-minute break. Thank you. Okay, when Mr. Coakley arrives, we'll resume.
You need to give him one of those buzzers like you get at the restaurant.
That's right. Somebody text him?
Yeah. Here he comes. We're waiting.
Okay, are we on? Okay, very good. We're back in session, so we will resume the questioning of the traffic engineer, Ms. Dolan. And I believe, Mr. Adler, you were in the middle of your questions.
Just following up on the trips during a day. How about the office workers? How many?
Again, I don't have those rates with me. I just happen to have some of that, the educational information in my file, but I don't have the office daily rate.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Parlapiano?
Just one last question about the shuttle trips, and I don't know whether you're the right person to ask, but have you done anything to estimate how long it will take for a student parking in the deck at Seton Hall's campus and then taking the shuttle, or should I hold that question?
The only thing I've done is look at the time to get from, as I had said earlier, point A to point B, and account for, getting stopped at a traffic light and having to have some time to unload and load passengers. That's the extent of anything I've looked at.
So you looked at a route for the shuttle from the main campus to Mary Lawn?
Yes.
And back? And what route did you look at?
I looked at the route from the parking deck on the campus itself, out, I think I went out the main gate, and then down to left so that we could turn to go up Scotland Road and come up to the site that way.
Okay, and how long did you assume that route would be?
You know what I did? I tried Google Maps, and I plugged it in, that way, and then I added on time, because I think it came in under 5 or 6 minutes. I don't recall exactly, but as I said, accounting for traffic, accounting for getting stopped at a light, and then the time to actually load and unload passengers. That's where I came up with 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
I got a question, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dwyer?
If you look at the figures 10 and 11 in your report, it talks about the levels of service at the driveway entrance from Scotland. And they appear to be some of the lower levels of service, correct?
Yes.
And is that driveway exit way 2-lane, right and left turn? No.
It's designed right now as 1 lane to accommodate.
Would that help if it was 2-lane?
What it would do is it would show then that the level of service for the left turn would probably still be a D, but the right turns would probably be at an A or B at the worst, because they'd be able to bypass. So again, that is based on that heavier direct left out as opposed to going out Vos and around the corner to head north. But that would be 1 lane.
And the driveway to Vos is another exit way from the parking lot?
Yeah, it's a 2-way driveway, and again, 1 lane for the outbound. Mhm.
Exiting.
Yeah.
You have other questions?
No.
Okay. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Okay, Ms. Dolan, your study assumed that with the 101 student parking passes, that you said that they will be issued so as to ensure there is no overflow parking off-site. Well, in that assumption that there are 101 passes given, yes, there would be no overflow, but then your other testimony also assumes in this that there will be essentially no other student parking in the surrounding area because they will all be taking the shuttle.
That is correct.
Okay. Is there any engineering expertise that you can bring to assume that students will all take a shuttle, and a couple hundred perhaps take a shuttle, as opposed to, as some of our selfish members suggested, that they would park nearby and just walk? Why would the students not just do the same? Is there engineering expertise there?
Specifically for students, not that I know of. There may be some statistics on how far people are willing to walk to get to a train or to a location, but I don't have any specifics that at least I can draw on that I recall. And as I had said earlier, I wasn't aware that those limitations didn't extend further beyond the subject property, and recognizing that there is a commuter lot for the train station there, that's, to me, makes complete sense why there are the restrictions posted. I happen to live in Fanwood, and I don't live as close to the Fanwood train station as this site is to the Mountain Station, but I have parking restrictions in front of my property. That was an assumption on my part, obviously an error, and as I said, if there was a desire to curtail any student parking in that area, then certainly the governing body could do that. But as to what it would mean for trip generation if restrictions weren't imposed, well, there's a possibility that, yes, there would be more traffic to the area. It might be moving to, as someone said, across the street on Scotland, so those numbers would be coming and going in directions, I'll say, maybe on the east side of Scotland. But yes, there could be an increase in the trip generation.
What engineering standard is there, if any, for how far people will walk? I can tell you my personal experience in South Orange, but is there an engineering standard, a half mile, a third of a mile, quarter mile?
I'm sure there are standards for downtown development. I'm familiar with shopping centers. 200 to 300 feet is desirable, but certainly when you're talking about this type of setting and this type of use, and I would compare this school use in this location to the walkability attractiveness of the train station. I think that certainly people might walk a greater distance to the train station. They might also walk a greater distance to the school location if that parking were available.
We live between a third and a half mile from the train station, and until there were parking restrictions put up, people were parking on our street going to the train every day. So I have personal experience people will walk that far.
And that's a third to a half a mile away from
Yeah,
the
closer
train,
to a third of
the
a mile.
mountain station, or
No,
the
to the central train station, parking on our street all day.
And that's why I thought, as I said, obviously I was wrong, but I thought that those similar restrictions would already be in place further from the Marylawn site.
So with the figure you used of 356 students could be on site at any time, and in fairness to the dean, he said there were 308 seats, so I'm not sure where that discrepancy is, but be that as it may, 308 or 356, either figure you use, if you subtract 101 parking spaces, that leaves somewhere between 255 to 207 max student cars if each student was taking a car. Now, I know they're not all going to take a car. There'll be some carpooling. Not everybody's going to show up every day. And that's a max number, and I'm not taking that literally, but some healthy percentage of that, potentially people could be parking in the neighboring streets and walking to school. 125, 150, 175. Is that possible?
I would have to look at the configuration of the streets and driveways in terms of the capacity or the existing parking utilization on those streets to see what would be, I'll say, an available parking supply on the streets within a third or a half mile of the site. We would have to do an inventory to determine what type of available parking there is if it were permissible for those students to park within
Let's say that
reasonable
there's no
distance.
parking restrictions on Irving or Terrell or on Raymond, and it was within a third of a mile. You think people might park there and walk?
Then it would possibly generate more traffic along Scotland and Beauce or through the intersections, and would certainly increase the pedestrian trips immediately adjacent to the site.
I have no further questions. Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, actually, I do. I'm sorry. This is about traffic volumes. You say that it's acceptable traffic volume. What do you mean by acceptable? Is that the grade, the letter grade? Is that what you're referring to?
The acceptable levels of service?
Yes.
Yes.
So is that kind of, we should look at that like we look at a report card, and A is excellent down through D or F?
Although what's different from your report card in school is that levels of service C and D are considered acceptable, and they're often the design levels when you're looking at a new intersection. So C and D are definitely comfortable levels of service, and it's associated with the average delay that these vehicles are experiencing. So while you wouldn't want D on your report cards, the C and D on the level of service scale is acceptable for the peak hour operations.
Acceptable, I mean, it's certainly going to be more than what's there now and what the residents are accustomed to. So you say acceptable, meaning that all the cars are out of there within 10 or 15 minutes. I just don't understand what the idea of acceptable means. I'm not trying to be difficult in this particular question.
We're looking at, again, this is not, I think you just said about what's happening in a 15-minute surge. That type of activity you would have at a traditional school like Mary Lawn, when the kids are coming in to get in their seats or in homeroom for a specific time, a start time for all the student body. And the same thing when you're leaving at the end of the day from a school or a church. You have those surges. What we're looking at here is not necessarily surges, but we are focusing on the overall peak hour, the peak hour in the morning, the peak hour in the afternoon. And we're looking at how the existing traffic volumes flow and then add in the traffic from the medical school. And when we compare the before and after levels, they're the same. So the amount of average delay on any given approach to an intersection isn't going to change to a perceptible degree to a driver. So we've added this traffic in, we've increased the traffic, but when we run the numbers and look at the before and after, there's not much of a difference. There may be a little bit more delay, but it's not enough to change that grading at the individual movements.
Thank you.
Right, that's a pretty typical standard, right? If you trigger a change from one level of service to another, then that's something you'd want to point out.
Which is what we were talking about earlier. If I had routed the traffic, as I keep saying, around the block, then maybe we might be looking at a signal timing change to give Montrose more green time than Scotland. And so if we found a degradation there or a change from a D to an E, then a mitigation might be appropriate, which in this case looks like signal timing adjustments.
Okay. Do our experts have any questions?
No questions.
Mr. Keller, do you have questions?
At this time, no.
No?
No.
Okay. Do members of the, did you have more questions? You're looking at me, Mr. Adler.
Just one. So is it fair to say that the number of trips per employee is some multiple of what? Number of trips in and out?
A number of trips in a day?
Yes.
I suppose, yeah, again, I don't have, and typically we run the numbers based on the building area, not the employees, but again, I can certainly provide you with that information.
But it's something more than one in and one out.
Well, right, so it has to be more than one. Mhm.
That's good.
A number of trips per day would have to be more than 2, I would imagine.
One in plus one out, 2
Right.
trips per
Right.
employee.
Right.
At the lowest for that type of use.
Do members of the public have any questions for Ms. Dolan? Ms. Bauer?
I don't think the mic's on. No.
Speak straight into it.
Can you hear me?
Now we
Oh, there
can.
you
That's better.
Okay, sorry, low voice. I want to ask you if you're familiar with the Transit Village standards of New Jersey Transit, where it's a half-mile radius around a train station that they expect or encourage people to walk in their redevelopment projects?
No, I'm not specifically familiar with that. As I just tried to testify and answer, I am not familiar with those Transit Village standards.
Okay. And are you a planner?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Is it your, is a total of 154 parking spaces required under the ordinance, or did you revise that in your supplemental report?
Well, we looked at it a couple of different ways. We referenced the university zone, which would yield about 158 for the medical school, plus then the ordinance for office, which, as I said earlier, it's 1 for 300 square feet of office space, which would be 19 for the Graves House based on the net usable space there. So that's the ordinance reference that I've included in my report.
So I came up with 162. What did you come up with, including the Graves 19?
Well, I actually found a typo in my report. It should be, if you take the 1 per 4 population, it should be 158, and then I had another 19 for a total of 177.
Okay, so you're saying 177 is required by the ordinance?
Although I'm not sure that the university zone requirement does apply to this use.
Okay. Is the 19 the number of people, or does that relate to the 300 square foot or whatever the requirement is for the house office?
We took the net area. I'm not sure if I have that area included in my report, but we took the building area from the architect. We divided it by 300, and so we said that that would be 19 spaces required. Therefore, there could be 19 driving employees at that location. So we've used the parking ratio to estimate the number of employees at that location.
Okay. And I don't recall any other, have you been here at every hearing?
I think I have.
I don't recall any employee testifying that there would be actually 19 employees. So is the 19 employees driven by the number of parking spaces, or is there a plan for some 19 employees?
The 19 employees would be driven by the parking allocation. The building area requires 19 spaces, therefore we assume 19 employees would be there.
Okay.
And that's where the 19 employees comes from, the parking supply.
So that's an assumption, there's no evidence that there's 19 employees?
It's my understanding there's no specific user yet for the Graves House, that it would be university staff and not likely associated with the medical school. So as far as I understand, there's been no change from that testimony that was given here earlier, that there's no specific user or number of employees targeted to use the Graves House at this time.
Okay. So if the Graves House were rehabilitated, and if it were used, and if there were employees there, based on the square footage, then 19 spaces would be required?
Based on the square footage, 19 spaces would be required.
Okay. And what's the square footage that drove that number?
I thought I had it in my report, but let me see if I have it in the other report.
It would be 19 times 300, that would be the net square footage, 5,700 square feet.
Well, I heard the 300, but it's, what is it based on the footprint?
It's based on the plans that the architect had provided that figured out the net usable area for office space within the building. So it would be the calculation that was just mentioned, 300 times 19 plus or minus a few square feet.
All right. So if the parking proposal, as you have described it in your report, in your supplemental report, were to go forward and there were not employees at the Graves House, 19 parking spaces could be knocked off the amount that's proposed of 202 or whatever it is.
That assumes there would be no use of the Graves House?
I conditioned it on all those ifs. Do you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah, I think you better repeat it, yeah.
Fine. Do we have a court reporter who can repeat it?
I object to the question. I think the question should be rephrased to say, if there's no use of the Graves house, then no parking is required. Is that really what your question is?
Not really, and I don't see any difference between that and the employees. There's no employees planned right now, and there's no testimony about employees being there. I don't want to argue with you, but it's a straightforward question, yes or no? Can we do without the 19 spaces?
I mean, I object to your question. It's not an accurate recitation of the record. There is a proposal to park the site based on a potential use of the Graves house for office use.
Will you instruct the witness to answer the question or no?
How do you interpret the question?
Me. If there's no employees at the Graves house, or if the Graves house isn't used, then those 19 spaces could either be allocated for student use at the medical school or not constructed.
That was the answer, thank you.
Okay.
I'll move on to my next question. With respect to the charts that are entitled two-way stop control summary, okay? The first one that I'm looking at is Montrose and Vos in the no build, and then comparing it to Montrose and Vos in the build. And so AM comes first.
Right.
Janine, is that part of the report or separate?
Well, there were appendices associated with the report, so all the good stuff is always in the appendices.
Looking for the page.
It doesn't have a number.
Well, unfortunately, they're not paginated. But if you look on the top left, this is all the pages that I'm going to be referring to. Excuse me, the top right, it gives the intersection or the driveway in the street. And if you look on the top left part, it tells you whether it's AM or PM peak. And then the first one is always the no build, and the second page, with the data for the same intersection or driveway, is the build. So that's how you compare them. I won't go through every single intersection on every single page, but I just need to ask a few questions. Do you have them?
I have the one from the original report. I don't have the one in the revised report, but I do have Montrose and Vos.
Do you have any notations with you as to which of these figures changed in the revised report as compared to the original report?
No, I would have to go back and do a movement-by-movement comparison for all of those. I don't have that with me.
Okay.
And I never summarized it. I would have to do that summary.
Okay. Well, that was actually going to be one of my questions. Do you have a summary, or could you prepare a summary of the changes between the original and supplemental?
And when you say the changes, you're speaking of the levels of service and delay in the calculations for the various intersection movements?
Yes.
That is something that I could produce, yes.
Thank you. All right. So I'll use your original since you have it. And again, this is Montrose and Vos in the no build, AM peak. And I noticed that down under C, where it says delay, queue length, and level of service, under C, vehicles per hour. Do I have that right? Vehicles over H is vehicles per hour?
Yes.
Okay, so eastbound on Montrose, you have 1478.
I believe that's the capacity. That's not the volume. The volume is up at the top of the sheet, where it says volumes vehicle per hour, about a third of the way down. Eastbound L for left 19, T for through 136, and R for right 80, eastbound.
Okay, so is the volume 16 eastbound?
The volume is 16 for the eastbound left.
Right. 136 through and 80 right?
Correct.
Okay, got it. And is there any difference in those figures eastbound in the build? Is it still left turn 16 through 136 and right 86?
we increased the
86,
right from
sorry.
80 to 86, so there's
Okay.
your increase.
Got it. So with the left and the through traffic being the same, you're basically saying that there will be an additional 6 cars in the build going eastbound on Montrose.
Right, because that volume would be coming from the west, and it wants to get to the site, so it comes up to the intersection and it turns right so that it can enter the Vos Avenue driveway.
Okay. Now, on the westbound side, the left drops from 44 to 22, from 109 to 99, and the right is about the same.
I have, if this is Montrose and Vos for the AM.
Westbound AM.
The left turn on westbound increases from 29 to 44.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry, I said drop, 29 to 44. So that's just going in the other direction, essentially, from what we
That's
just
correct. That's coming
discussed.
from Scotland Road, and when they reach Vos, they turn left to get to the site driveway.
Turning to the Scotland Stewart driveway, is that the, what is the Stewart driveway? Is that the driveway on Stewart that you propose to be chained off?
This is actually the Scotland Road intersection with Stewart and the Temple driveway. And if you look a little bit lower, a few lines lower, it says on the left side of the page, East/West Street, Stewart Place/Temple driveway. So when you're looking in the upper right corner where it says intersection, that's abbreviated. So it's the offset 4-leg intersection formed by Stewart and the Temple driveway.
Got it, okay. So the difference, for instance, northbound on volume, northbound, that would be Scotland, is 463 to 509.
Yes.
Southbound is just 540 to 544.
Yes.
And the difference is southbound Scotland in the PM between no build and build is 518 and 550.
That is correct.
Okay. And these are the same numbers, I checked some of them, that are graphically laid out with the arrows.
That's right. The numbered figures show the volumes for each of the movements that are analyzed in these pages we're discussing now.
Okay, got it. And the Scotland and driveway, that refers to the driveway that goes essentially between the high school, what is currently the high school, and the house.
Yet there's an existing driveway on Stewart, on Scotland, right, that would be maintained as the full movement driveway, and that's the driveway we're analyzing on this sheet.
And for some reason, I only have the build for Scotland and driveway. Can you tell me what the northbound and southbound through is for the AM and the PM?
I'm sorry, we're talking about Scotland and the site driveway?
Scotland and driveway.
And
right.
which number are you looking for?
I only have the build for the AM and PM. I think there was a miscopy
Well,
somewhere.
there is no build for this location because this is the future
Oh, I
driveway
see.
intersection.
So you didn't have any cars to count when you were...
Right, the school's not operating, there's nothing there, there's really nothing to model until we have the full capacity operation. So there is no build for that driveway intersection.
All right. And did you say that you used, let's strike that. Let's see what else Do you agree that, I think a number of questions have been asked about this, so I just want to confirm. Do you agree that parking restrictions would be needed on the adjacent streets that do not have parking restrictions in order to prevent students from parking? For instance, on the railroad, and you know where the train station is, right on the other side of the railroad is Meeker and then Clark, where I happen to live, and more streets over to Ridgewood. It's a very short walk to Mountain Station and just up the back driveway. Would you agree that parking restrictions would be needed on those streets?
If you were looking to clearly prohibit student use of on-street parking, then yes. If they're not already there for the rail commuters, that would certainly be something that would ensure that there'd be no parking on the street that wasn't wanted.
Okay. And let's assume that the neighborhood that is the West Montrose neighborhood, Meeker and Clark Street, you don't have to know which streets they are. If you do know them, that would be great. But let's assume that they have what I would describe as single-width car driveways. In other words, if you have 2 cars, you have to stack them, or 3 cars, they have to be stacked. They also have to be off the street at night. I'm sure you're familiar with the until 6 a.m. cars have to be off the street in this village. So when somebody wants to pull out, and let's say the other person is home for the day, or just stays at home, works at home, or is a homemaker, that car generally goes onto the street. The parking restriction would require more movements back into the driveway. Is that right?
Unless there were a provision for resident parking on the street.
So then you would have to get into decals on the cars to show which were the students who could be towed or ticketed, and which were the residents who could not be.
Right. The residents' cars would have to be identified as a resident of the area, and then presumably allowed to park outside of those restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Residential permit parking only.
And I didn't hear an answer to the question about what size bus was proposed for the 4 per hour, 15-minute, given, the time from Seton Hall to the medical school campus, plus, embarking and disembarking.
That's another witness. Mr. Signorello will be discussing the specifics.
Okay, fine. You would agree that there would have to be, at least if there's the peak seating capacity or whatever parameter or measure Seton Hall wants to use, there'd have to be at least 200 of those students on a peak day.
I think the number that has been discussed was ranging now between 200, 250, 275 at an absolute max. So those are the numbers that have been specifically addressed this evening.
Okay, so you would agree that a minimum would be 200?
A minimum of 200, I guess, for the peak conditions is probably the number that we're looking at.
And earlier, when you said that you had recommended that Seton Hall would not be able to manage this site by using what I would consider to be the most efficient parking pass program, and that is by overselling the lots. That's what most people do. Parking authorities, certainly this village does that and so forth, but there would have to be a static amount of passes, and everybody else would have to be on the jitney or park legally if that were possible. How does that account for night students? Would night students also get parking passes above the 100 because they presumably would not be in competition for the day spaces?
I think that's the idea, because there's so few of them. I think the number currently is 33, and they do have, under existing conditions, I think it is a night pass. But Mr. Signorello can specify that as well. But I would think that they would be allowed to have those spaces for a specified time in addition to the 101, what we're calling daytime student passes.
Do you know whether Seton Hall was agreeable to your suggestion that there only be 101 student day passes issued?
Well, that's the part of the group effort to get to this application, is to figure out how we can manage this. And we can guarantee, which was one of the words used earlier, that there wouldn't be more than 101 students parked on site if we limited the number of student passes to 101. So that is the plan that the team, the applicant, has agreed to, and that's the plan that we've discussed and presented thus far.
Okay. So I don't know whether that was a yes or no. Are you saying that I need to ask the next witness whether they would agree to that condition?
Well, I think that's the proposal.
That's the proposal.
Yeah.
Right. So you're saying since it's your proposal, you're agreeable to it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what we proposed.
So you would agree to that condition if that condition were imposed by this board?
Yes.
Can I ask a question just to clarify? I thought that there was a question regarding minimum versus maximum of amount of students at peak time being bussed in. And I think the question was asked, is the 2 to 250 a minimum? But I thought that was the maximum, not the minimum. I thought that...
Just a little while ago, we talked about 250 to 275 as being a maximum.
As a maximum, but in response to the question that was just asked, I believe you might have stated minimum.
Confused minimum and maximum?
Yeah, like I think you might have stated minimum, but in fact it was the maximum amount that would be necessary. So that, therefore, if it was the maximum amount, there's a potential that less would be needed. But if it's the minimum amount, then it implies that more would be needed. So I just wanted to clarify that
maximum.
The answer was maximum, okay, and not as stated in the question stated specifically minimum, and the answer was minimum. So I just want to clarify for the record that it is in fact maximum.
Well, what is the minimum? Because that was the question. So maybe you could re-answer that question.
I thought we were talking about what's the minimum number of students we should plan for at peak capacity. That, I believe, is 200. We need to accommodate or plan to accommodate at least 200 during peak hours. That should be the starting point of the plan.
Who would need to get there by van from,
Yes.
from the other deck.
So that's a minimum of 300 students total that need to be, or 301 that need to be accommodated, 101 of which would fit into the parking spaces proposed. And
You just speak into the
Oh.
microphone, Todd.
yeah, so just to restate, so that's a total of 301 students would need to be accommodated, 101 of which would be accommodated by the parking spaces proposed on site, and the remaining 200 would need to be bused.
That's, I think, where we're starting, yes.
Okay.
Can I have just one other clarifying question from that testimony? Is it your testimony now that the university would issue more than 101 passes because some would be only for the evening students and others would be for daytime students?
I think that they can allow the evening passes separate, but I would defer that to Mr. Signorello, because he's going to be talking a little bit more about those practices.
And just to follow up again, I'm sorry, but early on in your testimony, you said that 16 additional buses or 16 buses or bus trips could easily be accommodated without changing the thresholds of one level of service versus another. If you're talking about 200 students, and we have yet to hear about the capacity, but I seem to recall previous testimony that these are jitney buses, which tend to have a capacity of 25 seats. So if you were to say 20 per bus, that's 5 buses per 100. That's a total of 10 buses, 2 trips each, or 20 trips.
20 trips.
And would your testimony still stand that 20 trips versus the 4 that you had talked about previously would not change the thresholds from a C or to a D? Or
it would be 20 versus actually 8, because it was 4 in and 4 out.
Oh, it's 8, fine.
I don't think that magnitude of change is going to create a significant change to the results of the study. When we start talking about 100 trips in an hour, that's when you start to have a change in operational characteristics. So I don't expect that 16 or 20 trips versus 8 trips would change the results to any real degree.
All right, so you're talking about a general rule of thumb, but every intersection, every turning movement is unique identity in and of itself, and so you'd have to basically apply those numbers or have an understanding of each and every intersection in turn to make the statement that it wouldn't make a difference on
Well,
those.
to have an absolute answer, we'd have to add the volumes and see what the incremental added delay is.
Right. So you don't know what wiggle room you have for each one of those.
I would say
intersections.
there's certainly capacity available, but to give you an absolute answer, I'd have to crunch the numbers.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
We have questions from any other member of the public. Come on forward, please. Okay, make sure you speak straight into the microphone and state your name and your address, please.
I'm Eben Levy. I live at 59 Stewart Place in South Orange, New Jersey, USA. Apologize if this first question had already been asked. I wasn't sure. In the last session, the dean testified that the student body would grow by about 25% over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. It could happen before the school is built or in the time in which the school is built. And I just wanted to know if the traffic plan and the parking plan accounted for that 25% growth.
I thought at some point he said it was 2 to 4%.
And then I believe we clarified over the course of last session that when we did the math that it was actually 25%, isn't that right?
Well, I've not inflated any of the numbers by 25%. It was my understanding there'd be limited growth, and also that the room capacities are really what we were looking at. On one hand, we're also looking at the existing enrollment and the varying areas of study. Some are accredited, some are non-accredited, so there's all sorts of factors. But as to the specific question of increasing the number of students for the analysis, I have not done that.
Okay, thank you. And then this has been touched on a little bit, but just to clarify, if there were no passes given out for student parking, wouldn't that allow you to have more green space in keeping with the character of the neighborhood? And then just to follow up, you're already busing 3/4 of the students under this plan. Why not bus all of them?
I think this is improper questions. These are basically a summation.
No, that's a reasonable question.
But she's not a site engineer about green space. What does that have to do with?
Well, there was a question. He said you're talking about busing 3/4 of the students. Why not bus all of them and not have any parking? Is that a reasonable? You're saying is that a reasonable suggestion?
Correct.
It's a reasonable question.
I object to it. Go ahead.
From a traffic engineering perspective, I don't know that it's sort of a matter of fact. If there's no parking, then, well, someone said earlier, well, then you may encourage more on-street parking. If there's no parking on site, you reduce the trips. But from an operations perspective, I think it's more of a planning and operations issue than it is a traffic engineering issue.
Okay. You also stated tonight that the driveway at Stewart would be gated outside of emergencies. Is that something that you guarantee in some way? Is that something that could change over time? Would that be in perpetuity?
I think it would probably be a condition of approval that it would have to be gated or chained unless there's an emergency. So that would be something that the applicant, as far as I understand, would agree to.
And then if you were to decide a few years down the line that you wanted to change that, would that require you appearing before this board again, or is that something that would just be able to be changed?
We would accept that condition.
I see. Okay, thank you. Did the traffic reports that you and your team do take into account the school bus stop on the corner of Vose and Stewart that's used at the same time as your high AM traffic?
We did. We counted, so I had said that earlier tonight, any of the different types of vehicles that we saw, they were included in the count.
Great.
We're aware of that type of heavy vehicle activity.
And did you guys count the viable parking spaces on Stewart Place, which has no parking from 7 to 11 a.m., but then parking available after that time?
No, again, my thought was that perhaps that parking restriction might have to be modified or revised if this medical school is approved at this location. We did not account for any on-street parking in terms of parking supply or traffic activity.
Mm-hmm. And in your professional opinion as a traffic expert, would you say that Stewart is wide enough to maintain its current traffic flow with people parked on both sides?
It's a very low-volume street, and I know, like many residential streets, once you have parking on both sides, oftentimes, if you have two vehicles coming from different directions at one time, often one vehicle will have to pull over, maybe behind a parked car, to let the other one through. It's a pretty standard condition when there's two sides of the street parking permitted.
To that end, another question that I have that's sort of selfish just for me, I don't know how would I be able to pull the back car of my tandem garage out if there's cars parked in every spot on my street without breaking the law?
I'm not sure specifically what you're speaking to.
So if I have a two-car garage that's tandem, so I have one car behind the other, and I want to pull out the back car because it has the child seats in it, let's say, and there's cars parked in every spot on Stewart, I would have to double park to get out, and then get the front car out, put it back in, and then drive out.
Sure, you'd have to maneuver to an available spot on the street in order to get that car closest to the garage
Right.
out.
Okay, thanks. That's the end of my questions. Thank you.
Other questions from members of the public?
Hello, Sharon Pigeon, 412 Bose Avenue. Can you hear me okay?
Pull it down a little bit, please. Just take it out.
Is that better? Looking at the original traffic report, it referenced that the analysis were performed using the highway capacity software to assess the levels of service and delay for the no build and build conditions. Can you explain what that is and if that's typical to use the highway capacity software for the residential area?
Well, although it's called the Highway Capacity Manual, it does provide the methodology for analyzing non-highway locations, specifically signalized and stop-controlled locations. And it is the standard and accepted methodology that traffic engineers use to assess existing operational conditions and the impact of site-generated traffic. So yes, it is the accepted methodology.
Thank you. You mentioned early in your description that you balanced the counts from the different intersection to establish what the baseline levels were. Can you comment on how much variation there was before you balanced things?
In some cases, it was a few cars. I believe in all cases, it was probably less than 50. But I did, I think one of the board members may have asked if I would submit that information. I don't have the worksheet with me to testify to it, but I can certainly
But
return.
you will submit that?
I can submit it or come back and testify to it, yes.
Okay, thank you. Most of the discussion has been around the peak periods, but one of the big changes here is going to be for the evening use. Is there anything that you can tell us about the estimates for, say, after the evening peak hour, which I think would be a big change, big variation from what's currently there?
For the traffic study, we focus on the peak hours, and those are the existing commuter peak hours. But for the evening activity, it would be much lower than during those hours. I know that the one number I have from the university is 33 students with parking passes. It's a much lower number of students during the evening than it is during the daytime.
I understand that it's a much lower overall, but as a percentage of a change from the current situation, how does that compare?
Well, I don't have existing volumes or projected volumes to compare, but certainly the percentage increase would be less than the percentage increase we're forecasting for the evening peak hour or the morning peak hour. So there will be an increase, but it won't be as large of an increase as you see during the peak travel hours.
It won't be as large as a percentage or as large as an absolute?
I don't have the data to answer that.
I think that I heard you say, can you confirm that you just considered a standard statewide growth rate rather than looking at specifics for South Orange and anticipated population growth?
Correct. The methodology is to use, ITE has growth rates for every county in New Jersey and for different types of roadways. So the methodology for traffic engineers for forecasting future traffic volumes is to apply these background growth rates. It's not typically a study of population. If there were a specific development nearby that was going to be generating volumes, we would include that. We did consult with the board's professionals regarding that issue.
So given that there are a couple apartment buildings going up in South Orange, isn't it reasonable to expect that a good percentage of those people might be traveling down these roads to get to, say, 280 and major roads?
Sure, they may be, but by the time you distribute that traffic to the overall system, it can be considered accounted for in the background growth rate.
You mentioned that in the revised plan, you now have a designated place for the shuttle to drop off and pick up students. Can you describe where that is?
It would be in the back of the school building. There's sort of like an existing U-shaped cutout, and we've shown a loading area there that would serve for any loading, but also for that shuttle activity.
And do you have any specifics about the anticipated traffic changes during, let's say, the 2:30 to 3:30 hour when there's an increase of activity due to schools letting out and school bus drop-offs and things like that?
We recognize that there is that secondary peak in the afternoon, but again, we did not perform specific counts or analysis of that period for this study.
That's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Other questions?
I'd like to follow up on a question, if you don't mind. You had talked about the increase in the percent increase in service or in traffic volumes during the peak hours as opposed to the evening, saying that the percentage would be smaller. Do you have the percentage that the peak period would be, the PM peak?
I would have to calculate it. I could provide that calculation, sure.
Okay. It seems to me that it's likely that the percentage rate versus actual number of increase would potentially be larger in the evening than it would in the peak period because the numbers are so much smaller to begin with.
So we're talking a percentage increase could be greater during the later evening peak hour, but the volume contribution or delta would be less than during the PM peak.
Right,
okay.
exactly.
But what you're after is what is the percent increase in peak hour volume, right?
Right.
Okay.
And you don't have the data to report on the evening. That's what you had testified, correct?
I don't have anything past 6:30.
Right.
So we didn't count, and nor did I make any projections for the university activity after that.
Ostensibly, we have testimony from previous witnesses, the dean, I believe, and in fact from yourself saying that there are 31 parking passes for students for evening classes, right? Pardon?
33.
Oh, 33,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Ostensibly, all those students would be leaving at the same time.
Right. I had them all coming in during the evening peak hour, so that's as far as I took those 33. I brought them
Right.
in during the evening peak hour, but you're correct. Worst case would be they all leave when the staff leaves sometime later in the evening.
And the percentage distribution that you have for the site, is that in your report?
I
Like
don't know that the
which
specific...
entrance or exit that they...
We have volume figures,
distribution?
but not by percentages. But again, if that's something the board wants, I can certainly provide it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Other questions from members of the public?
All right, I have a few redirect. Is there capacity in the garage at Seton Hall for the students of the school to park to get on the shuttle?
Yes.
In doing your report, did you consider the traffic that was generated by Maryland?
I didn't specifically, no, not in this report. There's been no credit for any Mary Lawn former activity.
So you did the report after Mary Lawn closed?
Yes.
if you had done the report when Mary Lawn's open, there would be more traffic in the area.
That's correct, yes.
If this property was reused as a school of any sort, would there be more traffic?
Yes.
If this was reused as a school, would there be faculty parking?
Presumably, yes.
Have you ever seen a situation where there's not faculty parking at a school?
Many of the schools I've studied or am familiar with, the parking is largely dedicated to staff.
In high schools, they have student parking?
I know our school is student parking by pass and lottery.
And you testified that you were conservative in terms of how you analyze the level of service with respect to the site. Is that correct?
In terms of conservatively projecting the trip generation or driveway movements to and from the site, yes.
So there is certainly a certain amount of capacity left in the system if your projections were somewhat off.
Yes, that's correct.
No further questions.
So only because I apologize because I looked at, how many night students are coming in?
There are 33, currently 33 students with parking passes for the evening. But that there may be others, and I would have to go back to those tables and charts to see what kind of capacity there might be. But we've got 33 under existing conditions.
And evening students or night students are defined how?
I'm sorry, they what?
How do you define?
Oh, where did I get that?
How do you define night student? When do they come in?
Information from one of our project team sessions. I'm not sure who specifically gave me that or where it came from, but that's a number that's been in all of the number crunching I've done.
Okay, no more questions from the public? Okay, so as far as Mr. Coakley, we're not going to get to Mr. Steck tonight. But I think we should probably try to proceed with Mr. Signorelli at this point. What do you?
I don't know, it's getting rather late.
We can.
I don't think we'll finish with Mr. Signorello, so I'm not sure whether it makes sense to start.
Okay, then if we're not going to finish, let's not. There's usefulness and continuity, and so then I suggest that we adjourn the meeting for the evening. Is that okay with you at this point? Okay, all right. So that's what we're going to do. So then next month will be Mr. Signorelli, at least your plan now, and then the planner.
Well, now, next month, I'm away, and the university would like me to handle this, so we would request an extension till September.
Okay.
I'm away in August as well. Yes.
Okay. Well, that would, okay, that sounds fine with us, but then that means we can open up August for the Turner appeal.
Yeah. Okay.
So contact the Turners and let them know they're on for August. Okay. Now, are we gonna?
That it's carried till that.
Yes, I'm sorry. We're gonna carry Seton Hall until September, our regular meeting in September, and they will be first on the docket.
Okay, could we just put the date on the record?
I think it's the second.
Second?
Right, Jetta?
Second, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so then Turner will be on for, are we going to have a quorum here for August? Who's going to be here in August? 2, 3, 4,
I think so.
5. You're not here, Mike? Okay, and we don't know about, we can't assume Mr. Semper, 5. Bob Shapiro may not.
Bob Shapiro is around, I think he's
6.
away.
Okay, so we'll have a quorum. Okay. All right, so, yeah, set up the Turners for August. Okay, any other things that we need to resolve? I don't think there are any other pending cases. Jetta? There's nothing else that we need to resolve. Okay. Good evening.
Thanks for getting the resolution done so fast.
Really.